Good morning, everybody. My name is Thomas Backe. I'm a senior manager with Reftelis Financial Consultants. I'll be the project manager if we're successful in winning this project. With me is Colin Dratt. He's a senior consultant with me in our Kansas City office, and he'll do the model demonstration in a few minutes. So we've been given an outline of what we wanted to present today. If anybody has any questions while I'm presenting, please just raise your hand and we can stop and cover it just so we don't lose them. I don't mind, and then we can make sure that we have enough time to get through everything as well while answering your questions. There we go. So the first thing we were asked to present was a couple of case studies for projects that are similar to the challenges that we're facing here in the city of Sioux City. So the first case study I wanted to go over was the city of Saginaw, Michigan. The city of Saginaw is a city of about 50,000 residents now that's about 40 minutes north of Flint, which itself is about 40 minutes outside of Detroit. Saginaw provides wholesale service to they provide wholesale service to 19 customers. Basically, they provide wholesale service to that entire region that I showed on the map earlier, running from Frankenmuth, which is a big tourist destination, all the way up north to Delta College, which is University Center, is labeled on that map previously. And it's about 2/3 of their total service. So they first engaged by the city in 2004. They had engaged another consulting firm to perform a cost service study. And that consulting firm actually tried to take the Detroit wholesale cost to service approach that Detroit was using to charge customers and apply it to the city of Saginaw and their wholesale customers. They said, well, it works for Detroit, it's known in this region, let's use it for Saginaw. Well, what they didn't realize at the time is that they made a grave error in that they didn't weight the units of service. They didn't weight one of the cost parameters by units of service. In other words, what happened is they were using distant customers who are the same distance away, and one uses twice as much water, that customer pays twice as much for that parameter. Well, the consultant forgot to weight it by units of service. And so what happened is the furthest customer was actually their lowest usage customer, yet they were seeing a 200% increase in their charges. And they presented this to the wholesale customers, and needless to say, the wholesale customers got very upset when they saw these results. And so there was a damaged relationship there between the city and the wholesale customers. So we were engaged, we came in, we worked for the city, we corrected the approach, we simplified the approach a little bit because they were using a parameter. They were using elevation as a parameter, which Detroit uses, but in Saginaw's case, literally there were only like 5 feet of difference in elevation between the main pumping station and any of the customers, so it really didn't make sense to have it as a parameter in this case. And what's important here is what happened is not only did we correct this approach, but what we developed over time, we did the first cost service model there in 2005, is we've developed a process with those 19 wholesale customers. We see, and we're actually going through this right now with the city of Saginaw, doing the latest update of their model. We do the cost of service study with city staff, and then when we get towards the end of it, we have a meeting with all the wholesale customers. We get in a big room, a little smaller than this room, with representatives usually from all 19 wholesale customers, and some of them have 2 or 3 people at this meeting, so there's 50 people in the room approximately. And we present the results of the study to them, and we do this all together. And then over the next 2 days, we offer to meet with each customer individually. And so we can sit down in the room, city staff, ourselves, and the customers, and go over the cost of service, and it gives these customers an opportunity to ask any questions they have that are specific to their situation and just become comfortable with what we're proposing. Because in the city of Saginaw's case, the way we do the rates there is each community has an individualized wholesale rate. So they pay different base and volume charges based on their specific contract capacity as well as their current usage, how much we expect them to use over the forecast period. And so this is a process we found works well, for working with wholesale customers and establishing a level of trust, because each wholesale customer, we're not just developing rates for these wholesale customers and, as I call it, throwing it over the fence, saying, here's your rate, take it or leave it. We sit down with them and they have an opportunity to talk with us and be comfortable with those rates. Now, sometimes they don't like the results, but they've become comfortable with the process. They had one of their larger customers is Frankenmuth, which I mentioned before. They're actually a big tourist town. It looks like an old German village, actually, and they have the world's largest Christmas store in their town. But they were, they were a little uncomfortable with the rates. They actually examined building their own water supply system. And ultimately, we sat down with them repeatedly, and they became comfortable, and they were one of the last customers to sign a new contract with the city of Saginaw. So that's a process that's worked there. Now, this is water, but it's very similar in terms of, working with the wholesale customers. That's the important takeaway from that one. The next case study I want to talk about is the Metropolitan Sewer District of St. Louis. This is a map of their service area. St. Louis MSD is actually the 5th largest sewer utility in the entire country because they serve a vast majority of the St. Louis metropolitan area. We've worked with them since 2007. We were first hired. They have an interesting process for setting their sewer rates and their stormwater rates, where they have to go through what's called a rate commission. It's somewhat analogous to a PUC process that investor-owned utilities have to go through. But it's a rate commission established by their board. And so the district has to present, here's what we think we need for rate increases for the next 4 they do 4-year periods, is what they've historically done. And so at first we were actually, and the rate commission has their consultant and the district has their consultant. The district had been using a consultant for years, and the rate commission hired us as their consultant in 2007, and we served as consultant to the rate commission in 2007 and 2008. And we worked through that process with them and assisted the rate commission. And then in 2012, we were hired by the district to become their consultant. And so what's important here is we go through a very comprehensive sewer cost of service allocation model. Again, it's the 5th largest sewer utility in the country. We go through a very comprehensive allocation of high strength, inflow and infiltration, and other factors. Now, it is a little different than large industries there. Their biggest industry is Anheuser-Busch, not surprisingly, that contributes approximately 5% of their wastewater flow comes from just Anheuser-Busch. I'm going to have Colin come up, and he's going to give a demonstration of an example cost service model. We're going to use the City of Lawrence, Kansas model, which is a utility that we go through a very comprehensive cost service allocation process for, and we're going to use that to kind of demonstrate our approach to cost service, which should be pretty consistent with industry standards. Are you going through St. Louis? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's fine. We're using the St. Louis model. I thought we were going to use I apologize. Are there any questions on the case studies or anything else before we move on to this, though? Yes, sir.
Saginaw was just water only?
Saginaw is water only. Their sewer is really simple because they have one wholesale customer. We've assisted them a little on the sewer side, but what I thought was important, relative to here is just the relationships they've been able to build with their wholesale customers so that their wholesale customers, feel like they're included in the rate setting process and don't, like I said, they don't just feel like that the city is throwing rates over the fence and saying take it or leave it and not giving them an opportunity to understand it.
I just said it seemed like a common theme that it's not a one and done. A lot of these communities, it's a follow up after so many years, or how.
Typically, what we recommend is that you want to do a cost of service study every 3 to 5 years. And what we mean by cost of service study is where you actually look at the allocation of cost between parameters, between volume, customers, high strength, and any other parameters that we use to allocate cost and develop rates. But that doesn't mean your rates don't change every year. We're just saying, so you do a cost of service analysis every 3 to 5 years, and then you'll just do across the board increases, kind of in the interim. Your allocations between those parameters may change year to year, but they shouldn't change significantly each year. But after 3 to 5 years, you'll want to examine them again, make sure kind of the split of costs between those parameters is still accurate. Now, we have customers who do it every year. We do. City of Suffolk, Virginia, we've been doing their rates for 12 years, and they only have one wholesale water customer, but their contract requires that they do a cost service study every single year. So we go in and we do a cost service study every single year. And so it's somewhat up, but to some extent, it's a little bit of overkill. We didn't tell them to put that in their contract. They put it in their contract. So, we get the benefit of having to do it every year for them. But when clients ask me, how often should we do it? It's every 3 to 5 years is kind of, you don't really want to go longer than 5 years because you can have dramatic changes kind of in your usage patterns, your parameters, your cost allocations. Really, 5 years is about the maximum that we recommend. especially in, this is a slightly more complex system than many systems. If you have just a homogeneous, customer base, especially if it's all, kind of residential and light commercial, then it's less of a concern than here where cost allocation becomes a bigger factor. Okay.
I apologize, I'm going to have to be somewhat turned around, but once I find the sheet I'm looking for, I'll turn and face you and we'll talk through it a little bit. So this is the St. Louis MSD model. Actually, the model Tom mentioned first, Lawrence, they actually do have some wholesale customers, but what we really wanted to show you in this model is that there's a really detailed cost of service allocation process, very specific to sewer utilities. So that's why we kind of wanted to look through this. And I just want to mention a couple things really quick before we get into the cost of service. Where we're at right now is actually a financial planning dashboard. So this is kind of one of the features of our models, is just kind of a display of high-level results, so that when you're looking at, for example, the financial planning aspects of things, you can really see, when we get into the detailed spreadsheets, there's a lot of numbers and they go down many rows, but what these kind of things do is basically allow you to look at a high level and say, okay, given all the inputs, obviously it's important to understand them, where do things fall at a high level. So this is the financial planning one, and basically what this is showing is the bars are the revenue requirement kind of going up over time, and then our existing revenues, and then kind of where we would need to go. I mentioned, I'm not going to click on a sheet for this, is that this model, just like all of our other models, is tailored specifically to the client. So we will often get the chart of accounts for their financial system so that it's easy to input the information into here. So we try to tailor the model around the information around the information the city can produce, rather than saying, well, can you put it in this format so we can get it in our standard model that we use everywhere. So this is very specific to this client, but again, we wanted to show you, kind of walk through the sewer cost of service allocations a little bit here, just so we can kind of see those. So I'm going to skip past the financial planning piece. I should also mention that there's kind of three things going on in here. So there's really three steps when we do a rate study. We need to kind of determine the overall revenue requirement. So what's the size of the pie? What's the total level of cost that we need to split amongst all of our customers? So that's the financial plan. And we won't go through that now because we wanted to focus on the cost of service. But basically that determines, what's the bucket of cost that we need to recover from everyone. So financial plan. The second step is the cost of service allocation process, and that is, given the unique usage characteristics of each customer class, how do we allocate costs to that class of customers such that the revenue that we recover from them matches the way in which we incur costs as a utility? So that's the cost of service allocation process. So we're going to take that big pie and split it up and allocate it to the individual customers so that we recover those costs in the way that they cause us to incur them. So we'll go over that, and then the last step would be rate design, which is looking at, now that we know what we need from each customer class, how are we going to recover those costs from a fixed charge or a variable charge? So let's click a little bit through some of these. And I'm going to have to probably, it's going to be a little hard to see, but basically what we're doing on the cost allocation process is we're kind of going through a few different steps. So we have our operating costs and we have our capital costs. Those are the two kind of main categories of costs that we need to split amongst everyone. So the way that we do that is we're going to start by allocating those costs to the functions that the utility has to perform in order to provide service. So on the sewer side, I'm not going to be able to zoom in that way. I'm going to have to do this. There's one, sorry. So I have to click on Tom's laptop here. So on the sewer side, some of the functions that we perform are collection, conveyance, treatment, compliance costs, billing costs, and general and admin costs. So what we're going to do is basically take, and this is the O&M, these are the functions that we're allocating the operating expenses to functions, but we're taking our operating expenses and saying, okay, we incur these operating expenses, what functions are we performing by incurring them? And to the extent that, obviously, ideally, if we tracked everything by function, it would be very easy, but a lot of times what we have to do is we'll sit down and kind of have a conversation about, okay, what does this department do? How to, and kind of figure out how to split those costs amongst those various functions. So that's the first step, and we do this for operating and for capital. And for capital, usually, for O&M, it's usually it'll be kind of more based on a conversation of what each department does. So, with them, obviously, we sat down and determined what each of these, like engineering, for example. Obviously, they're going to have a little bit in each of these buckets, and it's just about kind of determining what the appropriate split is. And then for capital, it can be a little bit more straightforward because for capital, we have our assets. So one way to do it is to allocate your capital costs based on the assets that you have already in service, which you know what the functions of those assets are, so it's a little bit more straightforward. And basically the idea is we're going to incur capital costs, so we'll allocate those on the basis of the assets basically that are going to be used to provide that service. So that's the capital functionalization. And then once we functionalize, we'll take those functions and I'll zoom in again, I'm sorry, this is really far away. You'll see our different functional categories that used to be across the top here. And what we're going to take those, collection, conveyance, treatment, etc., and then we're going to allocate those to the drivers of those costs. In other words, what drives our collection system costs, our conveyance costs, our treatment costs. And those things are volume, capacity, again, we got compliance showing up, billing, and then our strength-related costs like TSS and BOD and COD. So we're going to basically take these functions, what functions do we need to perform in order to provide service, and then what types of customer usage cause those functions to basically go up and down. And once we know that, we can develop a unit cost for each of these cost drivers. So obviously this step will allocate the dollars. So we'll know what are all of our costs for volume-related demand, basically, and what are all of our strength-related dollars. So what's that bucket? And then what we're going to do from there is we're going to determine our strength units, our volume units, our capacity units, so including I&I, and then we'll use that to determine a unit cost. And once we know the unit cost, then all we need is each customer's units in order to allocate them their share of cost. So basically the idea is that the unit cost for everyone is the same, it's just everyone has different levels of demand. So we'll look at unit cost really quick here. And just so we'll stop here really quick too. So these are the units. So in this case, we had our volumes, so sanitary volumes, allocation of I&I, our allocation of strength, strength by each class, and then bills and meters. So the previous step was what goes into the bucket of dollars for volume, capacity, and strength. This step is what is everyone's units basically for those same things. And then we're going to use that to determine our unit cost. Zoom in again here. And again, you'll see these same cost drivers. We've got our units of service kind of summarized from that other page. We've got all of our operating costs by function and also by cost driver, and then down to our capital costs the same way. And what we're going to get down to is what is the unit cost, so the cost per CCF or per pound of TSS or BOD, what is the unit cost for each of these cost drivers? And then the other thing we know is what is everyone's units? So what is everyone's sanitary flow, their share of I&I, and their strength? And then essentially from there, we're going to multiply those out to allocate each customer class's proportionate share of cost of service. And that'll be, I'm not sure why that's not showing up, but I think that might actually be down here too. Oh yeah, there it is. Yeah, okay, so here's that step. So for example, we've got single family, we have their units of service, and then their cost, and it's basically, this is the unit cost multiplied by their units. So this is their cost for volume, which is based on their volume demand multiplied by the unit cost for volume. And we've got C, we've broken out Anheuser-Busch here in particular, just to kind of demonstrate where they would be at. But that's basically the step. We're going from what do we need overall, which is the kind of financial planning aspect of it. What we focused on here was the cost of service. And the logic is that we want our customers to pay in proportion to the cost they cause us to incur via their demand. There's a lot of discussion and conversation that has to happen, and understanding about why that was such a kind of, I think, an important case study for what we're talking about here is just making sure that, you know, we don't just do the calculations and say, okay, here's the answer, we did a study, making sure that everyone understands kind of along the way, is comfortable with the process and understands the inputs, the process, and then the end result. And then if we obviously, once we see it, if we need to go back and say, okay, well, what happened here? Why is this different? Just kind of getting everyone on board with it. But in general, the logic is we're going to allocate costs in proportion to customer class demand. So.
And in this case, customer classes would include wholesale customers.
Right.
And then there's still an outstanding question, you know, like I said, the big thing that comes into play when you're dealing with wholesale customers is, do you treat wholesale customers as a class so that all wholesale customers pay the same rate, or do you treat them individually based on their individual demands? And that is something that we would work on during the course of the study, is determining what's appropriate here in the city of Sioux City. Like I said, in the case of Saginaw, we treat each individual customer as their own class. So each individual wholesale customer, is their own class, and then we have retail is a separate class. So in Saginaw's case, basically, I said they had 19 wholesale customers. They have 20 customer classes. They have retail is a single customer class. Actually, they have 21. They have a very small number of outside city customers, retail customers that are treated as a individual customer class. That's actually a very small number. And then they have the 19 wholesale customers, which are basically each an individual class, and then they get a rate based on their individual demand. And what's important, to reiterate what Colin said, what's important about the cost of service approach is we develop unit costs, and the unit costs are the same for all customer classes. The reason rates are different for different customer classes is because they use different numbers of units. So some customers, and part of this comes down to, one thing we've done with some sewer utilities now is they have different rates for even retail customers. Commercial and residential may have different volume rates. And the reason the rates are different from a cost of service perspective is because on average, commercial contribute higher strength wastewater than residential does. And so we actually, when you look at the amount of units of strength in commercial, it's higher than it is for residential. And that's how we justify, from a cost of service perspective, charging them a higher volume rate. You know, sewer is actually regulated by the EPA user charge requirements, because basically every sewer utility that's been around for more than 30 years at some point or other has gotten grants from the EPA to do something. And once you accept that grant from the EPA, you're basically bound by EPA's what they call user charge requirements. And the user charge requirements require that for you to charge different customers a different rate, you have to have a cost justification. But we can develop that cost justification. We can't just do it arbitrarily saying, well, we don't like our commercial customers, we want to charge them more. You have to have a cost of service justification. And the cost of service justification you can often use is, hey, they're really contributing higher strength. Something a couple of customers I've worked with have gone through is they've actually gone out and measured some businesses that typically aren't monitored, and a big one is restaurants, for example. I did some work in the city of Madison, Wisconsin, and we weren't part of this project, but they shared kind of their process and the results and their sampling results with me because we were talking about it while I was having a meeting with them on a project we were doing with them. And they went out and they sampled 20 of their restaurants. They did, 5-day composite samples at these restaurants, and they found these restaurants were putting in approximately, I want to say the average was like 800 milligrams per liter of BOD and TSS. And, domestic is usually 300. And most cities charge restaurants, just as domestic strength 300. But really, when you go look at restaurants, they often surcharge. Allocation, which is the large utility that provides regional service in the Pittsburgh area, did a similar study like 10 years ago that they shared the results with us, and we saw similar results there. So there are justifications for doing that, not only to wholesale, but you can get into that for retail customers as well. Are there any questions on that? Yes.
When you provide this model, is it your model or is it the City of Sioux City's?
So our model, and Colin alluded to this a little, is when we build a model for a client, we build a model from scratch to make sure that it fits. We're not going to take your data, your budget data, your billing data, your usage data, and try to fit it into our model. We're going to take our knowledge and build a model based on industry standard methodologies like we demonstrated that matches your data. So you'll be able to take your budget data and drop it in there. When we're complete the project, you own the model. There's nothing proprietary about our model. We actually got into, in the St. Louis MSD case, the reason we became the consultant to even though the model was built using the customer's data, using industry standard methodologies that are published in WEF manual practice number 26, somehow they claim that's proprietary, taking the customer's data and applying industry standard methodologies to the customer's data. I never understood how anybody could claim that's proprietary, but they did, and that's the reason that they ended up not getting hired, because quite frankly, we were 50% more expensive than the previous one. So it wasn't a cost issue. They were just very upset that consultant tried to claim that the model was proprietary. So we deliver our model to the clients. You can use it. And one of the things that you can do with the model is, like Colin mentioned, it has a financial planning piece that'll look at a multi-year planning period. I think here you guys indicated you wanted to look at 20-year planning period. Now, I always caution, we can go out as many years as you want and do a financial plan. That's pretty, it doesn't cost us any money to add more columns to Excel. We can do that. The challenge is that you want to be sure you're comfortable with your capital improvement plan in particular out that far. One of the things we really don't know is what our regulation's going to look like in 20 years. Because the challenge is you could say, here's what we think rates will be for the next 20 years, but you may not have you have confidence in what you need to do over the next 5 years and how much that's going to cost you, but what's going to happen 15 years down the road? I joke sometimes, with some of my clients in the past few months that, by the end of after 6 more years of Trump, we may not have any, environmental regulations left, although, Pruitt's gone now, so who knows? But, but certainly we face different, examples of being faced with new mandates on how we have to handle our wastewater, that we may not have expected 10 years down the road that have come. And so that's what you want to be careful when you do multi-year financial planning. You don't want to go out further than really you're comfortable with. We did a project for San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, which provides wholesale water service to the entire San Francisco Bay Area, not just the city of San Francisco. And there they had to do seismic improvements to their regional water supply system. They had to spend $2 billion on seismic improvements that provided no additional capacity, no improvements to service. It just protected what they had against an earthquake, a potential earthquake. And so, but those improvements had a 100-year useful life, and it would take them 18 years to build them. So when we looked at just those improvements, we did a 118-year financial plan looking at the cost of those improvements to the retail and the wholesale customers. Because the study we actually did there was looking at how they wanted to recover cost from the wholesale customers, because the wholesale customers were concerned about the impact of the cost. So we basically worked with them to develop kind of an analysis of here's the approach, your current approach to recovering wholesale costs, here's an alternative approach. And they did end up changing their approach, because what happened is the way they were doing it before, the city of San Francisco would have had to front a lot more money to pay for those improvements than they were comfortable doing. So
how'd that play out?
What do you mean in terms of?
So you did this 118-year rate,
It wasn't a rate study, it was basically a financial analysis on those specific improvements, the $2 billion in seismic improvements. And what happened is we showed, because they were using what's called the utility basis for recovering cost from wholesale customers. And the utility basis is basically how investor-owned utilities work. It's return and depreciation on assets, and then O&M costs based on CAS.
So they did the $2 billion, right?
They're in the process of doing the $2 billion, yes.
How is that played to rates?
How has it impacted rates? They ended up moving to a cash basis methodology where the wholesale customers pay for the cost of those assets based on how much they're actually costing upfront instead of paying return and depreciation, because what the city of San Francisco was uncomfortable with was the fact that they were going to have to front $2 billion of money to the wholesale customers and recover it over the next 100 years. But they couldn't finance it. They didn't want to finance it for 100 years at the time. The city of DC actually recently issued 100-year bonds for some capital improvements. Now, those are for deep tunnels that are drilled into the rock that should, in theory, have easily a 100-year life. However, it was still, they called them century bonds. They're for 100 years. Of course, what makes them even worse is they were issued with 95 years of interest only and 5 years of principal payments at the end. That's what we call kicking the can down the road. We'll let our great grandchildren pay like I said, I mean, the warning is, the city has indicated they want to look at 20 years, and we're comfortable doing that, but we just need to be careful. We don't know what's going to happen 10 years from now in terms of CIP, and so that's kind of the grain of salt you have to take right, well, exactly, right, something will come down the line, phosphorus or something else will impact us, that we may not know about or we're just unsure about right now.
So the other question I have for you, I just want to make sure I understand it. So when you guys got into the whole restaurant component of it, you found that there were contributions coming from that side?
Oh, absolutely. And other ones are auto repair shops sometimes have higher, strength surcharges. And most communities do not monitor those types of businesses. Now, Alcosan, like I said, the regional utility in Pittsburgh was trying to do it, except they were using union employees to do it who only worked between the hours of 8 and 4 and would go out and do a grab sample. And so it just wasn't very useful. But even from the grab samples, we could see some of the grab samples were really high. Others, they would go out and sample an Outback Steakhouse, which isn't even open for lunch during the middle of the day. And of course, they didn't have any high strength, because there was no flow. And so what some communities have done, there's two approaches. City of Little Rock, we developed a rate where they have a higher commercial rate based on higher strength. And there we just said all commercial on average has a higher strength. And, we've done sampling and we're comfortable with that. Other communities have taken it and they assign strengths to businesses. They used to do it by SIC codes, but SIC is kind of outdated now. It's NAICC or something like that now. And so, they would have restaurants, auto repair shops, and they would have kind of basically assigned strengths for these different businesses. And that's an approach that you can, that can be used to do that. Okay. Any other questions?
Couple, Tom.
Sure.
Not quite sure how to phrase it, but you talked 2 or 3 times about I&I. Have you thought deeply about how?
So I&I.
At Sioux City, considering that we've got sister cities and then we've got industries that probably don't have a lot of I&I.
Yeah, and so you have to look at, it's I&I is a big challenge because if you ignore it, which a lot of utilities have done in the past, then it just gets recovered on whatever you are taking into account in your cost of service allocation. And there are a lot of cost of service studies for sewer utilities that just ignore I&I. And so then but the reality is, I&I is a significant issue for sewer utilities that provide retail service especially. And, the best estimate, and it's a pretty rough estimate, as you can guess, is that approximately half of I&I comes from laterals. It's not even assets that the utility owns. It's from customer laterals connected to our system. And so you need to do an examination, and some utilities will do studies. In St. Louis, probably 15 years ago, they had CDM do a study, and CDM came up with the estimate that obviously had a high level of precision because it was 2/3 goes to volume, 1/3 goes to connections. And so it's usually, but it's based on, getting the right people in the room to have that discussion to make your best educated estimate of what that allocation is, split between flow and number of customers. Now, of course, that should only impact the retail customers, and that's done, to assure that, the retail is paying their appropriate share for those I&I costs and that we're covering from the retail customers in an appropriate manner. And so once you split kind of those I&I costs between customers and volume, then the customer cost you want to put into a fixed customer charge, and then the volume component can just go in the volume rate.
And what goes into your compliance cost driver? What do you look at?
Well, the compliance in the case of St. Louis, but that's a pretty common one. That's the cost of going out there and doing high-strength sampling commercial customers. And commercial customers are in one of 5 tiers. A vast majority of their commercial customers, 90 to 95%, are in tier 5 and pay a very small amount for compliance. It's like $3 a month off the top of my head or something like that. So they pay just a little bit for compliance, but recognizing that they're really just offices, stores with just, 1 bathroom or something like that. They're not, there 5% of their customers fall into one of those higher tiers depending on, where, how much compliance monitoring they need. The city of Milwaukee MSD goes through a similar process, who's a client of ours. They have, I believe it's 5 tiers as well, where basically you're put into a tier based on, and in Milwaukee MSD better defines, if you're in tier 1, you're sampled 4 times a year, 5-day or 7-day composite sample, I think they do. If you're in tier 2, you're sampled 2 times a year, and they may only do a 3-day composite sample, and then the costs are higher the more you're sampling. So it's to make sure that those customers who are causing us to incur these sampling costs and these compliance costs are paying their appropriate share of those costs. Folks like you, probably.
So where does the regulatory fit into that, or what you know at that time about future regulation? I'm driving towards nitrogen phosphorus right now.
Well, for us to be able to, we could add, you saw we had BOD and TSS in the St. Louis model. And what would happen is if you wanted to have a phosphorus component, you would add phosphorus as a driver, and you'd identify the costs that we allocate to phosphorus. These are the costs that we're having to spend money on to recover phosphorus, and then you have to have some sort of approach for actually billing that to customers. So if you're monitoring for it, then we can develop a unit cost for it and charge those customers, who have higher than standard phosphorus loads on our system. We could charge them that amount. I mean, you can go through that process. Some places, one interesting one is fats, oil, and fog, fats, oil, and grease. Some places have fog as a component. Of course, fog is a little challenging because some places try to measure it in strength, and you can, but the reality is we don't really have added costs. Most utilities don't have added costs at the plant. It's a collection system issue, and it really just it's when you get a lot of it, and then you get a clog, and you got to send a Vector truck out there to fix it. That's where and so it's more of in theory, it's less of a cost. You can't really allocate it like this accurately because it's more of a penalty than it is an actual charge when you look at how you charge for it. But it can be done. It is similar, but it is a little different in how you have to handle it because it's not quite the same. It's not as an exact a relationship as the other ones that we showed you. Yes.
I'm intrigued about this restaurant charging separate because we could do that in the city of Sioux City because we obviously have the client list for the city.
Mm-hmm.
How would you model with the sister cities where we're just getting waste on a pipe?
Well, so the sister cities, I mean, basically they should be paying for everything that comes through the pipe. So the challenge we have, for our retail customers is we don't want to go out there and monitor them. For the sister cities, my understanding is we monitor them pretty precisely, and we know exactly how much load that they're sending to our plant. I believe that's the case.
But from their perspective, maybe they don't want their residents to be paying for the restaurants.
Well, and that becomes an issue for them on how they design their retail rates. The sister cities have to design their retail rates to recover the costs we send to them. I mean, for instance, we charge them for high strength, and my understanding is some of the sister cities have some industries that they probably monitor. And they may have to monitor those, EPA may really require you to monitor them. But let's just say they said, we're just gonna charge everybody the same volume rate. They could make that decision if they wanted to. How they decide to recover the cost we send them through their retail rates is their decision. They could certainly implement the same thing that I said that we could consider here. On average, restaurants have higher strength, and you can justify charging them a higher rate to recognize the higher strength on average that they contribute to their system. And so then because in effect what happens is, Colin mentioned the pie, and I always use that analogy. Once we develop the financial plan, that's how big of a pie we need. That's how much money. We go through the cost of service allocation and the rate design. That doesn't change how much money we're gonna get. It just changes how we're going to recover it, from different customers. And so we're just changing the pieces of the pie. So, we send each of the sister cities, a pie of their own that they have to recover, and it's up to them to decide how they split that among our customers. But in effect, if we give restaurants a bigger piece of the pie, that makes the rest of the pie for the rest of our customers smaller, so everybody's rates therefore will be a little bit lower because restaurants are a little bit higher. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm just trying to work how the model would work, because we could do it on our side because we have the data.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that there's a large amount of restaurants.
They get a proportion of the high strength based on what they actually send us. We know how much strength they're sending us, and they'll pay for however much strength they're sending us through the rates that we develop based on their actual strength loadings, which includes their restaurants. And so if you had one sister city, and I'll admit, I don't know the demographics of all the sister cities, but I imagine some of them are more just residential, and some of them are more industrial. And so the more industrial and commercial ones have higher strengths on average than the residential ones, I would expect. I don't know that for sure, you never know what's going on, but I would expect. So when we do the rate design, when we do the cost of service allocation, this will come down to what I mentioned before. Whether we treat the sister cities as a class together or whether we treat them individually, and that's a decision that it can be made, or we can just handle certain components separately. We can handle strength separately, making sure that a sister city may have the same flow, but if they have 25% higher strength, then they should pay for make sure that they're paying for that additional strength in the cost of service allocation.
So to do that, then we'd have to sample, for the sister cities, they have to sample where it goes into the system.
Yes. But are you doing that? You don't sample the sister cities continuously? Okay.
It's the volume chart, right? Mm-hmm. So
They're sampling the industries then.
Yes.
Industries, but not.
Yes.
Oh, that's, I think what we, based off of what they're
Well,
saying is, you guys set
okay.
up an individual restaurant rate.
We could, and then we monitor all your flow right now, all the sister city flow. It's all metered. It's just not sampled. And so you could, if we did that for restaurants in the city, you could have the sister cities report the number of restaurants and say, we're going to charge similar rates. How much volume have you billed to restaurants? And here's the differential that we expect to collect. So that if you have a sister city, say you had two identical sister cities, one had 100 restaurants, one had 50, so you're making sure to get the additional revenue from the one with twice as many restaurants is the one that doesn't. And there are some communities that do that for wholesale, because what they'll do is they'll have parameters that they bill on, especially if they're not metered. There's some communities, even for wholesale customers, they'll just say, you're going to pay us $50 per house per month. And that's how they charge. And in part, the city of Kansas City does that for that. The city of Kansas City, we did a sewer cost service study for about 10 years ago now. And they have 4 different ways they bill their wholesale customers for sewer, because they're all different. Well, they're not, some of them are the same, but they're different. There's one community, Gladstone, which basically has 30 interconnections to the city of Kansas City. So it's literally impossible for them to meter all that sewage flow, because they don't want to install 30 sewage meters for a community of only about 30,000 people. It would be cost prohibitive. So what they do is they say each house each single-family residence you pay, and I'm going to make up numbers, this is probably high, $20 a month. For commercial, they use water billing data, and they say you'll pay, based on how much water billing data there is for commercial. For other customers, they meter all the flow, and that one's easy, then they do a meter. For other ones, they just use water billing data instead of metering the flow. And so they have different customers who have different approaches, and then there's some communities that they serve that actually use more than one approach. For the City of Liberty, they metered half the flow from the City of Liberty, and then the other half they just based on number of houses. So there's a lot of different approaches you can use to assess the cost to wholesale customers like the sister cities. And that'll be part of the process. Once we determine the size of the pie, is how do we want to recover these costs from the sister cities that's fair and equitable. The challenge we face, with utility billing, more so with sewer than water even, is balancing complexity of implementation. It's in theory possible for us to monitor every drop of flow and measure the strength of every drop, do continuous sampling, 15-minute sampling, 24/7, 365, and know how much flow they're sending us and have a pretty good idea of the exact strength. But the cost would be much higher, and would it really buy us much more accuracy versus accuracy worth it? And so that's one of the challenges we face, in a situation like this in designing how we want to assess our sewer rates is we know things can be more fair, but there's the more fair we make it, usually it costs more money. And so at some point, it doesn't make financial sense for us to do these things to make it more accurate, because it's just costing us more money. And if you increase your cost by 10%, everybody's rates will probably end up at least as high as they were anyway, and you'll have no real benefit. Okay. Any other questions before we move on? We only have 15 minutes left, so I do need to try to get through. The next thing we were asked to talk about was, and you'll have to excuse me if I don't get the exact wording off the top of my head, Mark, was he just wanted to talk a little bit about the qualifications of our team members and our support staff. And so the team that we're proposing for this project is made up of the 4 folks shown on the, I need to switch, sorry. Let me switch back to my presentation. Okay. So the team we're proposing is made up of four members of our staff. RFC, Mark asked us not to cover kind of the stuff we include in our proposal. RFC has 85 consultants who provide these types of services. The 4 folks we have assigned to our team are all in their Kansas City office. Be myself is the project manager. You see we have a technical advisor, Bill Standard. I'm going to talk a little bit more about him here in a minute. Colin Dratt would kind of be our lead consultant, and then we have Joe Collins, who works in our office, who would provide us so he would do a lot of the dirty work. But the 2 most important members of our team are myself. I'm the project manager. Sure, side. I've been working for Raftellus for 17 years. I know you said not to do this, but I just feel I need to spend 30 seconds doing this. Raftellus, we only provide financial management consulting services to municipally owned water, wastewater, stormwater utilities. Basically, these types of studies are all we do. We're the largest firm that does these types of services. We have the largest group of people that do these types of services. I know one of the other competitors will come in here and they have thousands of employees, but in terms of the number of employees doing these types of services, they have maybe a dozen or 2 dozen. We are the largest firm that provides these types of services. So this is all I've been doing for the 17 years I've been with Raftellus, because this is all we do are these types of work. Now, in terms of wholesale rate setting, which is obviously one of the key issues here, I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience. I've talked about some of these projects already. Saginaw, Michigan, Kansas City, Missouri, which I just talked about, Suffolk, Virginia, Detroit, Michigan. Now, Mark asked us to give you 2 case studies, and I wanted to spend just a couple minutes talking about Detroit, Michigan, because you'll see this on Bill Standard's resume here in a minute, too. Detroit owns the regional water and sewer system that provides service basically to the entire southeast Michigan area. So about 20% of the volume is in the city of Detroit, and 80% is in Macomb, Oakland, and Wayne County outside of the city of Detroit. So they're a huge regional provider, and they have a very complex cost of service rate setting process that they go through for those wholesale customers. Bill Stannard has been working on that for approximately 30 years. He used to work for a large engineering firm, and they were the rate consultant for the city of Detroit for years, and then he came to work for us about 15 years ago at Raftellus. And since that time, he and I have done several projects in the Detroit area. We've worked for Oakland County, who's one of the customers. We've worked for Flint, Michigan, which was one of their customers, and you may have heard some of the challenges they had with Detroit water and using other sources. We did work for Genesee County, which is the county that Flint is in, and then we've also more recently started working for the city of Detroit, because actually what happened is they were forced to divest that regional water and sewer system as part of the bankruptcy proceedings. Because we actually worked for Oakland County at the time. Basically, Oakland County was forcing them to divest those assets, because basically the wholesale customers who were buying 80% of the services didn't really have much faith in how the city of Detroit was managing those assets. And so they basically forced the bankruptcy judge to have the city divest those assets into a regional authority. So a new governmental authority that wasn't owned by the city. Complex cost service allocation process. They have about 80 wholesale water customers and 40 wholesale sewer customers. The reason there's a lot less sewer customers is because many of the customers outside the city have formed kind of regional utilities of their own, and that's why there's less, but they serve about the same area. Wyoming, Michigan, we've done water and sewer cost service studies there, and we've helped them with their contract negotiations, and that is a very similar case to here, because they have 4 to 5 each on wholesale water and sewer utilities, and we're currently doing a water cost service study for them right now to help them change the contract with one of their customers. Saginaw Midland Water Supply Corporation, Northwest Water Commission, Illinois, and then San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, which I talked about a project we did. We've done a few projects for them, but they are actually a very large wholesale provider too, like I said, on the water side, providing basically water for the entire San Francisco Bay Area. Bill Stannard, who wanted to be here for this interview actually, but is committed to, he's speaking at the National Association of Clean Water Agencies summer conference right now, and he just couldn't come here. He has 40 years experience providing these types of services to municipal and some investor-owned utilities. He used to work for a large engineering firm based in Kansas City, and then 15 years ago he came to work for Raftellus. He has, you'll see on his list, he has many of the same clients, and then some notable different ones that I personally haven't worked on are Edmonton and Calgary up in Canada, and then also Alpena, Michigan, which is actually a project Colin and him have been working on, where they're having some interesting negotiations for water and sewer wholesale service there. They ended up suing each other, and they're spending a lot of time going back and forth on trying to determine appropriate rates. So, in terms of, and then Colin, like I said, he's the lead consultant. He's been with us about 5 years now. He's worked on many of these projects too. He's worked on Saginaw, Detroit, Edmonton, Alpena, Suffolk, and so he's worked on many of these clients with wholesale issues. Joe Collins been with us just 2 years. He's worked on a few of these. He's worked on Saginaw, Suffolk, and maybe a couple of the others as well. So all of the people assigned to your project team have experience with wholesale customers. Of course, those of us with more experience, and like I said, Bill, who has a lot more experience than me, have a lot of knowledge in dealing with complex wholesale issues like you're facing here in the city of Sioux City. Does that address what you wanted to cover on that point, Mark?
Yeah. Any questions about it? You're good? Okay.
I mean, our intention is the 4 people that I showed you are the 4 people who will be, completing this project. The Kansas City office for our firm only has 5 people in it, quite frankly, so it's not like there's other people we can bring in, and our intention is not to bring in folks from other offices around the country to work this project. So I think we can fairly commit to you that the 4 people you'll see on the bill, except for maybe a couple hours here and there, those will be the 4 people you'll see on your invoices each month if you select us. The final thing you asked us to talk about, Mark, was discussion of deliverables. Oh, sorry, I've got two things going here, so I got to remember to change them. So in terms of the deliverables we expect to deliver to you, we talked about, the financial plan and the model. So we'll deliver a multi-year financial plan that'll go out, like I said, as many years as you want. You indicated you like to go out 20 years. I've given you just got to be careful how far you go out and make sure you're comfortable with the assumptions that you're using. We'll deliver to you the cost service model. Like I said, it'll be yours to use however you want. And when we deliver these models to clients, some clients use them kind of as an ongoing tool, to say, because what happens is 2 years down the road, you can take our model and you can replace the things that we were projecting for the next 2 years with what's actually happened. And for instance, on the financial plan, the example I use is, we may project that we need 4% rate increases for the next 5 years. But you may enter what's actually happened in terms of how much you've spent, how much you're billing now, and you may say, oh, we're actually in better shape. We can actually lower that, a percent, down to 3%, and still end up in the same position that we wanted to be, not sacrificing our. On the other hand, if things, turn out worse than you expected, you can, take a look at it and not just be pulling, numbers out of midair saying, oh, and you'll be able to understand why things have not gone how you've expected. You'll be able to see, oh, our consumption is down a couple is. We'll give you up to 8 hours a year support. If you want to use our model on our own, you can call us and we'll help you use the model, and we'll give you 8 hours a year at no additional charge. We're happy to talk to our past clients. We like it when our past clients call us. So we're happy to help you use the model. Of course, you can always hire us to do that for you too, and we're happy to do that as well. But some of our clients do that, some of them don't. Of course, we'll have a written report that'll document the approach, the methodology, the findings and the results of the entire cost service process. And here with the wholesale customers, that's probably very important that you have a written document to help explain it to them. Then finally, the customer outreach. And this is one that, that wasn't necessarily all that well defined in the RFP, but this is something, I mentioned what we do in Saginaw, and I think that is something that you want to consider doing here, which is having a meeting just with the sister cities to go over kind of how they're being impacted by the results, and then give them the opportunity to sit down one-on-one with both us and city staff, and we can go over their specific concerns about how they're being impacted. And now we can also do that at the retail level. If there's going to be retail impacts, we can have customer outreach on the retail level, and that needs to be better defined. I can't tell you exactly what those look like because that's really working with you. Another kind of, it's not customer outreach, but there's also your council outreach. Some utilities like to have a workshop at the beginning of a project with the city council to kind of outline, here's what we're going to do, and it also gives us an opportunity to talk with them about what we call pricing objectives, which is saying, when we get to the end, we talked about financial plan, cost service, and then rate design. When we do the rate design, what we typically do is we use what's called pricing objectives to kind of dictate, here's the objectives we're trying to accomplish by changing our rate structure, if we're going to change our rate structure from. Because the financial plan will tell you we need 4% more revenue, for example, like I said before. Now, if you're comfortable with your existing rate structure, you could say, well, just raise all our existing rates by 4% and let's call it a day, we're done. You don't even need to look at your rate structure. But when you're doing true cost of service, what you're doing is you're actually looking at how do we recover all of our revenue. And so not everybody's rates may change by not everybody's bill will change by 4%. Some people may see an 8% increase, others may see a 2% increase just because of changes in their demand characteristics. So those are the deliverables as we envision them for this project, with that last one still being, kind of somewhat to be defined, but, I've kind of given you my perspective on some of the things that may be valuable to do here in the city of Sioux City. One final thing I wanted to mention, and this wasn't part of what Mark asked, is we are a registered municipal advisor. And this is important because what this means is that we're legally able under the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act to provide you advice as a municipality on the sizing, timing, and structure of debt issues. And this is important in a financial plan because if you're not a registered municipal advisor, firms that are not a registered municipal advisor are not allowed to provide you advice related to the issuance of bonds, including just saying, well, you should issue a 20-year bond. If I come in here and I say, and you have a capital improvement, and you say, well, what would you recommend on like the bond? For me to provide you an answer for that, I need to be a registered municipal advisor RFC is a registered municipal advisor firm, and myself and Bill Stannard have both passed the Series 50 exam, which allow us to oversee projects and provide that type of advice. Finally, if it's okay, I just want to kind of give you, we want to do this work for the city of Sioux City, and, we think, we offer you a unique combination of experience and qualifications. We have, regional here in the Midwest and national experience providing similar services to, the utilities I've talked to you about today. We have extensive wholesale rate setting experience, all those projects that I've talked to you about today and many more that, I haven't talked about, especially, like I said, Bill Stannard's been doing this 40 years. He tells me that he did a project here in Sioux City 25 years ago when he worked for Black & Veatch. And he tells me that I need to go on a kill floor like he did when he was here. And I'm like, I think I'll pass. But, we have a proven process that, that's for doing these types of projects. We have modeling expertise to deliver you a model that, will be good for not only this project, but hopefully many years in the future. And we have, passion and dedication. Like I said, this is all Raftellus does, is projects like this, serving municipal utilities, providing financial management consulting. We're not worried about $1 million engineering project or $2 million engineering project down the road. All we care about is making sure that the rates and charges are fair and equitable and meet the needs of the city of Sioux City and all its customers. So that's the end of my presentation, and we're just about out of time, but anybody else have any questions?
Have you dealt much with, in the different communities about, one of the questions that come up in one of our groups before was like connection fee, or how do you deal with new development that comes in? Is there a portion of that makes sense, or have you dealt with that?
Well, and we can include connection fees, and there are, specific processes you go through on connection fees and identifying how much cost can be recovered through connection fees and how to structure those connection fees, because basically there's two approaches. You can either do a buying approach where you look at existing assets and a customer buying into the assets, or you do what's called a marginal incremental approach, saying, well, if we have to build new assets, here's how much it would cost, and that's how much they should pay. One thing that you have to be careful of on those fees is customers should receive a credit for what they're going to pay when they connect to the system, because the example we use is, say you build a brand new plant today and you 100% finance it, and you have a customer that connects today. You're going to pay debt service. That debt service is going to be paid through rates for years, so you have to make sure that you recognize the fact that that customer is going to be paying debt service through his rates, and so there are those types of adjustments that need to be done in determining those fees. So it's not as straightforward as just taking assets and dividing it by usage and working from there. There are other factors you need to make sure are accounted for to be fair and equitable to those customers, especially because connection fees are one of the most litigated items when it comes to utility rates. And so you need to be very careful in how you structure them and design them, because that is literally the most litigated piece, compared to rates and charges. In general, regulatory bodies, city councils are given great discretion in setting rates and charges for usage. To take that to a court of law, you have to, typically the standard of proof is you have to prove that they were arbitrary and capricious to get rates overturned. However, impact fees, there's literally constitutional issues that federal courts have found it to be an unconstitutional taking of property if you don't design them properly. So you have to be very careful with impact connection fees, whatever you call them. We've seen a lot of places. One of the things that always kind of bothers me is some places try to call them connection fees when really they're impact fees. And I've seen them where they try to come up with inventive names. So they're like, well, that's not an impact fee, it's a connection fee. It's like, well, what does it recover? It recovers the capital cost of the assets used to serve them. Well, that's an impact fee, and if it ever got dragged in front of a judge is going to know the difference too. A connection fee is literally the cost of physically connecting to the system by the proper definition.
So is the charge for adding capacity always then spread over all users?
Well, so the challenge with capacity is we have to build capacity in big chunks. And so we build a big chunk of capacity, and then those customers come on over time. And so it's our existing users who always get saddled with the cost of carrying that capacity until those new customers come on. Now, and we can charge those new customers when they come on, but then in effect what happened, because the example we use is, say we build 5 million gallons of capacity, and we try to design a charge that'll recover every penny of that 5 million gallons capacity, the challenge is that charge will be most likely that charge will be so big that you're never going to get 5 million gallons worth of people buying into it. And you may get one customer, so are you going to charge that one customer for the entire 5 million gallons capacity? Well, you can't do that even though they're the only new customer. And so it's always our existing customers to some extent who bear some of that cost. And so it's really designing those impact fees to recover as much as you can from the new customers. But that's the challenge that we sometimes have is people are like, well, growth should pay for growth, period. But it's hard to do that in a fair and equitable manner sometimes because somebody's got to bear that cost of carrying that capacity. And you can't charge it to a customer who doesn't exist. You can't, a customer who connects 10 years down the road, he should pay his fair share, but it's his fair share when he connects. And so that is the challenge with impact fees. I see Mark standing up. He's getting ready to give me the
Yeah,
boot.
we're out of time, I'm sorry, but I guess if there are other questions, we can sure put them in an email to Tom and Colin, and we tell them that. Okay, well, thank you, Tom and Colin, appreciate your time. Do you need your,
Yeah.
okay. Okay, I haven't got that yet, so. Let's see.
Probably.
Thing of who's here, so you kind of know. So on your left here are our sister city representatives, and then back here I'll point him out because he's the only one. Stan Sherman is an industrial representative, and then everybody else here is City of Sioux City. Okay. And so with that, we'll just turn it over to you. You already know the format and everything, yep. So we'll go with that.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. For those that I didn't get introduced to, my name is Brian Backe. I'm the project manager for HDR. I've been with HDR for 18 years. I'm out of our Des Moines, Iowa office. I'm our Iowa managing principal, and I'm really thankful for the opportunity to come and present our thoughts and our team. I'm not going to be up here alone. I got a lot of great resources and support today. The first being Sean Korn out of Bellevue, Washington. Now, don't let that fool you. Sean spends a lot of time in the Midwest. He's helped me with rate studies in Lincoln, Nebraska, Ames, Iowa, Iowa City, Denison, Rapid City, South Dakota, and Sioux Falls. And we're going to touch on a couple of those as part of our case studies. Another guy with 18 years of experience came into HDR about the same time I did, and we've worked well together over that time. Then some of you may recognize Bill Moran. Bill's been with HDR for a few years. He formerly served as an acting city engineer here in Sioux City for a while. He's up in our Sioux Falls office. And Bill's been involved in a lot of utility planning work and rate studies throughout his career and brings a lot of senior leadership. With that, we'll jump right in. The city needs a comprehensive cost of service study, rate study that performs a lot of different things. First, develops prudent financial policies. It provides adequate long-term funding for that is sustainable. Provides a rate transition plan to fully support operating and capital needs. It proposes equitable and cost-based rates and system development charges. And we're going to talk a lot about developing equitable cost-based rates today, balancing kind of the engineering perspective of sewer and how that relates into a cost of service that's fair and balanced. Works collaboratively and effectively with City's project team, working with all of you folks in the audience, the partners, public, and also City Council. HDR is going to work collaboratively with you to provide, to appropriately fund and equitably allocate your operations, maintenance, and debt service costs to develop rates and policy. Develop rates. We're going to talk about our credentials a little bit and the deliverables, follow the outline that was provided. But before we do that, Sean's going to provide an overview of the process because we don't want to be real repetitive in our case study. So he's going to kind of go through kind of the overall process, and then we'll dig into each case study after that.
Thank you, Brian. So when we start a rate study process, we go through and use generally accepted principles. And our principles are based on the Water Environment Federation Manual Practice number 27. So that outlines the approach, the methodologies that can be used to establish cost-based wastewater rates. When you look at that manual, it talks about 3 key steps. And that's a revenue requirement, a cost of service, and a rate design. And what the revenue requirement does is it takes the total of all the operating costs over the next time period, 5, 10, 20 years, plus the capital funding analysis. So we know there's capital improvements that have to be made, there's renewal replacements, there's expansion, there's changes on the system. How are those going to be funded and how does that impact rates? And so when we look at the revenue requirement, ultimately what that does is it tells us what the overall revenue needs are over the next time period. So what is that percentage adjustment to rates in general for the entire system? What's that going to look like? Then once we know that, we can take and allocate those costs through a cost of service analysis. And what that cost of service analysis does is equitably and proportionally allocate the cost between the different customer types. So when you think about how the city system is set up with the local collection system, we have the treatment, we have the sister cities, we have industrial customers. How do each of those different customer types interact with the whole system? What costs do they drive? What infrastructure needs do they drive as part of that? And that's what that cost of service methodology does, is looks at those different customer characteristics to determine how we allocate costs so that everybody's paying their, I'll do air quotes here, fair share of the cost. And it's really not about fair, even though that's our goal through the study, it's about being equitable. It's about going through and looking at those costs. Once we know the overall revenue requirement, the overall allocation of cost between the different customers, then we can design rates to collect that overall revenue level. That's kind of that last step. We really know the answer, but then it comes down to the policy discussion of how do we charge each of our different customers? Because we can charge them differently based on how they utilize the system. And so we'll take that information, you can develop different alternatives to review. When we think about a system like the city of Sioux City, it's a big, broad system. You serve a lot of different types of customers. And so this is an example of what I call a regional rate methodology. And so the starting point for that methodology is over here in step one. That's that revenue requirement piece. And that includes both the entire cost, that revenue requirement that we talked about. But then we can split that because there are different costs that benefit different customers. So this is kind of a precursor to my Sioux Falls case study that I'll go into here in a minute. But what we do is we can split specific costs between specific customer types. And so we may take costs and some go down here to the local side, some come up here to benefiting everybody, all the different customers that participate. And then we can take those costs, and so we split their regional and our local, and then we can allocate them between those that share in those costs. Now, it's important to remember that we may pull costs off to specific customers or to the city as itself, but ultimately the city is also a customer in these costs, and I'll explain that more in the Sioux Falls example. So we take step three, we can expand that, and here's our regional costs. And we allocate those costs based on the customer characteristics. So we're talking about overall volume. What's that wastewater flow that comes to the plant that needs to be treated? We can talk about capacity. And this is a unique characteristic that we can look at, but it shows how different customers may impact the system on a max day or peak day event. And there may be differences between how you serve different customers, specifically for your larger customers that play into the system. Then we have strength. That can be a large component. Brian's going to dive into a little more detail in his example of how strength can change the allocations of cost. But ultimately that's relating to BOD, TSS, nitrogen, phosphorus, biochemical oxygen demand, total suspended solids. Even though I'm a rate guy, Brian's beat it into my head what those little things are that I got to pay attention to. And we can allocate that to everybody. And so when we think about the regional cost, because ultimately the sister cities have their collection system over here, industrial may have pre-treatment, we need to think about how everything plays together as part of this process and what drives the overall cost. So that is a foundation of how we think about a rate study, big picture, and it plays right into the Sioux Falls example that I wanted to talk about. And really what this started out as is the city of Sioux Falls was interested in how they should develop a rate methodology for their new customers connecting to the system. So it was really those that weren't connected today that wanted to come on the system, and then they realized, well, if we're doing that, we need to think about how we're charging our customers today. How are they coming onto the system? How are they paying through rates or system development charges or other fees that can recoup the cost of providing those services? So in the beginning, we had a handful of existing customers that were paying into the system on monthly rates as part of that. And we came back with some regional principles. We sat down with the city folks, we sat down with all the regional partners, and we had workshops on what the overall principle and methodology should be for establishing the city of Sioux Falls rates. And so those were very productive. We came back with principles. We have a new regional customer will buy into the available capacity through a system development charge. So as those regional customers sent more wastewater to the plant, then they would pay a system development charge for that as part of it. So they pay for that capacity cost on the capital side. They're going to use a cost of service to equitably allocate the cost. And I'll talk about this in a minute. That was a big component of this analysis, is coming through and looking at the infrastructure costs. And they had engineering staff at the city that went through and drew the lines of how everything worked on that process. And that's ultimately what played into the cost of service analysis. And then finally, all regional customers will be metered separately. That way they can track and bill each customer appropriately. So here's the city of Sioux Falls system. We've got a treatment plant over here. We've got our regional customers. Again, this is just an example. They can be anywhere outside of this area. We've got a meter point here. And so that first step of identifying what is that regional system? What's that infrastructure? And so the first one, pretty easy, the wastewater treatment plant. That was a facility that served both the city of Sioux Falls customers and all of the regional customers as part of that. But we also have this backbone system, and it's not as simple as that. It's not a nice little one straight pipe that gets all the way to the treatment plant, but that's the purpose of this analysis, is to look at what facilities benefited each of the different customers. And we had some rules of thumb. We didn't worry about where folks were. It was a regional system. Wherever you connected, you would pay for those facilities and the costs associated with those facilities wherever they were at. But we were able to kick out the local collection system. So we've got all this different system in here that benefited just the city of Sioux Falls customers. And so that was separated off to the side as part of that. And so as I said, we met with everybody up front. As we worked through this process, then we actually sat down with folks to refine and massage all of those principles and financial policies for that allocation process. So we really started getting into the meat of the analysis. There's questions that come up that, okay, how do we deal with this type of cost? How are we going to look through that process? And so we talk about directly assigned costs. That's where we have directly assigned local costs or directly assigned regional costs. The issue is a lot of the costs in the city of Sioux Falls system were joint costs. There wasn't this simple split of, okay, this is a local cost, this is a regional. It's doing business as a city of Sioux Falls wastewater utility. And so we had to come up with a process to allocate those. And we did that on a postage stamp basis, so we didn't worry about location, as I said earlier. But the key driver here is how each customer, local and regional, impacts the system on both the overall volume and a strength component. So when we started with our revenue requirement, we took a look at it, used the cash basis approach, and this is the total regional system. So this is everything, $18.7 million. And so we took that cost, and then that's our starting point right here. That's our blue box. So that next step was then to say, okay, how do we allocate that total revenue requirement between our local and regional customers? And so what we did is we went through a process where we identified those facilities, as I talked about on that map, to look at what those costs, what facilities are there that benefit everybody, and what are those costs that should be associated with those facilities. Was the local costs. That stayed with the city of Sioux Falls customers. We had $13.3 million of regional costs. Now, as I said, remember, when we look at that cost allocation, we take our $13.3 million in our orange box, we allocate it and classify it based on our volume, capacity, strength, and customer to each of our customers. But remember, the city of Sioux Falls is one of those customers. So we have the regional customers, and then we have the city of Sioux Falls. And then the city of Sioux Falls has their local costs that come back down to their overall cost, as well as the regional customers. They have their own local costs that play into that. And so as we went through this, what we determined through the classification is, of that $13 million, 50% of it was volume related. So that's just driven by the total needs of the system. So that's to be expected. It's a wastewater treatment plant. It's big pipe. That's the parameters that are needed, that those are sized for us to meet those volume parameters. We had 32% capacity, 10% BOD, 6% suspended solids, and 2% TKM. So that's how we allocated those costs. So each customer class Each of the regional customers in the city then gets a proportional share based on their costs on their use of the system. So if we have 50% of our costs being volume related, and the city of Sioux Falls was 90% of that volume on the system, they'd receive 90% of those volume related costs. And that's how we go through that process, so that each customer class pays their share of the cost. The way this turned out, here we have a summary table of the cost of service, and we have existing, which is the yellow or green bar here, the blue is the proposed, and we've got the numbers down here as well. But you can see, this is just regional, that's just the 13.3 piece of the puzzle. We had $2.63 currently for the city, that went down to $2.58. Some of the others went up and down as part of that, but one of the key drivers was that capacity allocation factor. There were 2 of the regional customers that could actually control how they released flow into the city system. And so they were able to slow down or stop their flow when the city was having peak day events. And so they were allocated a lower share of those overall costs. So this is a very detailed analysis. This is why Brian and I and others teamed together on this, so that we have both the financial and the engineering side, because we dive pretty deep into the engineering side of things to figure out how costs should be allocated as part of that. So the second part, I'll be brief on this, is the system development charge, but this was a policy that they implemented as part of their approach to establishing cost-based rates that new customers connecting to the system would pay a system development charge. It's a one-time charge to reflect the cost or the value of that capacity that's in the existing system, or that needs to be built going forward. So if they have to expand the system to meet the need. And so it was equal for all customers on a per ERU or equivalent residential unit basis. So we calculated what amount of flow is that equivalent basis, and it's charged to all customers based on that. So it's for all future connections. In the case of Sioux Falls, they actually grandfathered in the existing regional customers at their current capacity. So they drew the line and said, here's your capacity today. Anything above that you would pay an SDC for, but you have the capacity that you have today as part of that. And then the issue was, how is that funded? Well, that's up to the regional customer. This is something that in many cases under a system like this, that cost is passed on either to the customer, or the city or entity incurs that cost and it's picked up through other revenue sources as part of that. Generally, it's passed on to those customers connected to the system as part of that. So the SDC does not vary depending on where you are in the system, or specifically what facilities. You're part of a regional system in this case. And those facilities were the regional interceptors and the wastewater treatment plant. Those were the big. The reimbursement is that existing facility. That's the capacity in the pipes today. The improvement is any future additions to capacity. We've got to expand the wastewater plant. We've got to put in new pipe, bigger pipe, that's part of that. And the sum of those is our regional SDC in this case. So what that looked like, eventually was going to be $2,391 per equivalent unit. For a bigger meter, you have a larger based on equivalency factors for those meter ratios. So in the end, what this came back to was our approach that they're taking a look at yet today. As new customers come in, we continue to help the city with refining that and looking if there are any changes that need to be made depending on the customers that are looking to connect to the system. And we've been working with them on this process. But ultimately, we have each customer paying a wholesale rate, which was built on a utility basis approach. So there was a rate of return component built into that rate as part of the approach and methodology that was developed with the working team. And they would also pay SDCs, the existing customer, for any additional capacity, and anybody new coming in would pay a full SDC for their entire value of their capacity. And with that, I'm going to let Brian talk about Denison.
All right, so Sean did a good job of just talking about how we might, apply some regional principles to Sioux City, and how you could use that to evaluate whether or not you wanted to take more of a regional approach. Denison is a little different. Denison wasn't looking at regionalization, but how to equitably allocate their cost of treatment to some large industries. Some that were coming in and asking for more capacity and some that were leaving, and some process changes along the way. So that's why we think this one is relevant. And it was just completed here in the last year. So some background in Denison Municipal Utilities. HDR has been working with them for about 40 years with a lot of their wastewater treatment needs. Several large industrial contributors, Smithfield, Tyson, APC, Quality Food Products, to name a couple. They had some upcoming plant improvements, some aging condition related needs, and new blowers, just general rehab, aeration piping, so on and so forth. About a $4 million project that they were planning. And about the same time, Smithfield came and said, okay, wait, time out, we need some more TKN capacity. And how can we work together to do this? And so we put the plant improvements project on hold, and we dug in to see what we could do to improve capacity for Smithfield's treatment. Before we talk about that, here's kind of some wastewater process flow diagrams for just some reference. DMU is pretty interesting because it's basically two plants in one. They have the top box is basically the sanitary plant, which treats all of the domestic, residential, commercial, and light industrial from the residents of Denison through a flow path or a flow train that includes clarifiers and trickling filters and secondary clarifiers. The thing that's interesting to note, though, is the effluent of that plant actually flows into the bottom box, which is what we call the joint plant. And then it combines with influent from Tyson and farmland and APC and gets treated in an activated sludge plant before it gets disinfected and discharged to the river. So this is important to note because how the wastewater gets treated impacts the cost of service. And we're going to dig into this a little bit more, but what farmland was looking for was how can we increase the capacity of this train to accommodate more TKN. Ultimately, we needed to provide additional treatment, and through about a year's worth of negotiation and discussion and evaluation, we decided that we were going to build some new anaerobic lagoons to pre-treat Smithfield's wastewater, but we were going to do it at the DMU treatment plant. And they're going to be owned and operated by DMU. They're going to be cost shared and paid for by Smithfield. That included another industrial lift station and an anoxic basin to reduce the nitrogen in the plant and provide additional capacity. A large industry closed around the same time, Tyson. So we needed to evaluate what was the impact of adding more capacity for Smithfield, taking out some capacity for Tyson in the long run, in the whole plant operation. Cost of service and rate study was a requirement in the treatment and cost share agreements between Smithfield and DMU as a result of the improvements. So Smithfield wanted us to make sure they were going to put a bunch of money into the treatment plant up front to pay for some of these improvements. They wanted to make sure that the rates weren't going to also increase and they were going to be double dipping. So they wanted to make sure that there was a transparent cost of service study that showed how the rates were going to change as a result of the improvements. EMU wanted to address like what if Smithfield went away, what if an industry comes, what about regulatory requirements, and so forth. So that we did some what if scenarios to address that. So as a result of the improvements, we now have or it's being constructed as we speak, a new industrial pretreatment anaerobic lagoon that's going to serve some future industry, Allocation, Smithfield, and APC. The effluent of that lagoon is going to flow part of that joint plant to provide additional capacity. We've gotten rid of the trickling filter and the final clarifiers as part of the sanitary plant, and that effluent of the primary clarifiers flows into the joint plant as well. So what does this mean for cost of service study? Well, when you're looking at cost of service, we first have to figure out what the cost is for treatment in the joint plant, and then include that cost into the cost for the sanitary plant so that we can come up with our domestic rates. For the Smithfield rates, we need to come up with the cost of service for the joint plant and then include the percent removals and cost of treatment in the anaerobic lagoon. It's important to know that the anaerobic lagoon provides really cost-effective BOD removal and solids removal. It doesn't do anything for total nitrogen or total organic nitrogen, TKN. And so when we look at the rate structure that resulted from that analysis, you're going to see how that lagoon impacted the rates. So this is for the joint plant. So it's really a two-step process. We had to do the joint plant first, then the sanitary plant. And here's the strength allocation. Sean talked about that for Sioux Falls. It's a little bit different story for Denison, as you'll see. Smithfield and DMU, this is the effluent of the sanitary plant contribution to the joint plant. It's about 39% of the BOD is from the sanitary plant, 42% from Smithfield. That's effluent to the anaerobic lagoon. We'll talk about that here in a bit. about a similar percentage on total suspended solids. The big thing here is nitrogen. You can see that Smithfield is 86% of the total nitrogen contribution to the joint plant, as opposed to 11% for DMU and 3% for APC. None for Tyson, they went away, so they don't play into the mix. But it's that nitrogen component that really drives the cost of service for the joint plant. Here's another example of where the wastewater engineering expertise and capabilities comes into play in developing the cost of service. What we do is we take all the unit processes at the existing joint plant, which are shown here in white, and we assign them or allocate them based on what they do, based on and how they're sized, basically. So is it treating just a volume, or is it somehow removing BOD or oxygen demand? Is it removing solids? Is it responsible for nitrogen removal or phosphorus removal or fats, oils, and grease? We can parse this out however we want. We do that for every single unit process. And then Sean takes this and puts it in the sausage making of the model and says, well, okay, based on the operating costs and maintenance costs of these facilities and their asset value, we come up with what it costs to treat a pound of BOD and it costs to treat a pound of nitrogen at DMU. We did some what ifs here as well because we were planning on some expansion. We wanted to include the future unit processes that were going to be constructed in the analysis, so that industrial lift station I mentioned, the anaerobic lagoons, the anoxic basin, gas handling, blower building, and so forth were all included in the cost of service study. When we go through that model, we come up with strength allocations of cost for the revenue requirement. That's shown here. So total revenue requirement for the joint plant is about $2.1 million. Of that, 1.2 is strength related, and the other 450,000 is volume related. Of the strength related components, it's about half is related to treating nitrogen, and then the other half is split between BOD and TSS, or total suspended solids. Then we allocate that or parse that out by customer. And this is kind of the graph that Sean was showing earlier, where you split it all apart and then you combine it all together. And this is how that relates when you do this by the allocations by strength and flow and so forth. So you can see that of the $2.1 million, about $1.4 million of that was related to Smithfield only, mostly because of that major nitrogen component. When we look at that compared to the revenue requirement or the current revenue, we can see that DMU, which is all the domestic, industrial, and commercial, was paying about $450,000 towards the operation of that joint plant, but their allocated cost is about almost $600,000. So they were underpaying for their portion of the treatment in the joint plant by about 28%. And we're going to talk about how that results in rate increases. Smithfield, on the other hand, was underpaying a little bit, or overpaying a little bit, sorry. DMU was underpaying, Smithfield was overpaying by about 8%. This isn't, earth-shattering, it's pretty close. What we found is that we weren't going to make a rate decrease for Smithfield as part of this, but through escalation and how the rates will increase over time, or the cost of service will increase over time, it'll catch up, and it wasn't a big deal that we had to address immediately. Same thing with APC, is that those will catch up over time. The resulting rate design, so the current rate is shown here, 18 cents per pound of BOD, 14 cents per pound of total suspended solids, and 28 cents per pound of TKN at the time, is what their rates were. And that resulted in an annual sewer bill for Smithfield of about $1.5 million. We weren't going to reduce the rates for Smithfield because we knew it would catch up, so we took the cost of service, we looked at the rates, and we basically came up with these proposed rates to reflect that. So 57 cents per 1,000 gallons on a volume basis. The BOD significantly reduced. And why is that? It's because we get a significant amount of cheap treatment in the anaerobic lagoons for all the BOD that Smithfield sends, and that reduced the BOD cost from 18 cents down to 6 cents per pound. However, the TKN, which we changed to total nitrogen, went up from about 28 cents per pound to 75 cents per pound. So the total bill for Smithfield isn't going to change. But how we break that up and how they help do pre-treatment on their end is really going to impact their bill. We know that their BOD swings are really high and low, depending on the level of pre-treatment that they do. Well, that's not going to have a big impact on their bill at 6 cents per pound. However, their TKN is really pretty consistent year in, day out. And that is the majority of the cost to DMU, and that part isn't going to change a whole lot. So what we wanted to do is get DMU and Smithfield out of this BOD cycle of pretreatment failures and big surcharges versus, you know, not performing really well and not having enough revenue for DMU. So this equitably distributes the cost and the cost of treatment between the constituents. Now, I told you it was a two-step process. We took the joint plant stuff, rolled that back into the sanitary cost of service, and you can see that we were a little shy here. We can see assumed rate adjustment, 6%, 6%, 6.2. Those are the rate adjustments needed because of the rate requirement in the joint plant that we had a gap for the DMU portion of the flow. And so, in addition to that, we looked at breaking up the residential family, commercial, institutional, and industrial by strength allocation, just the same way that we did for the joint plant. And when we came up with some rate adjustments, based on that, we talked about a couple of different rate scenarios with them. We worked with their board to say, okay, do you want to take a big step at the beginning? Do you want to spread it out over time? And basically, we worked through with them iteratively back and forth to come up with something that could be supported by everyone. They're not doing anything at this point. This is for their information. They have 3 years until their construction project is complete and they start paying back their SRF loans. So they have some time to kind of watch and monitor and then check back in to see if these are still applicable. So we're going to update these after the midpoint of construction next year. So with that, I'm going to have Sean dig into a model review.
So as I quick change this here and grab one of my files, one of the things I wanted to talk about is that we build each of our models from the ground up. So we don't have a template or a corporately required analysis that we have to do. And so we take your information, we take generally accepted methodologies, and we develop this model. If you look at all the models we do for folks, they're going to look similar. They're going to have very similar exhibits, but they're all built around each utility or city's unique facilities and requirements. And so what they're going to do is capture that component so that it ties to the city's accounting records, to the customer characteristics, to all of that information. And so what I have here is an example of what we did for City of Sioux Falls. And what I wanted to show you is here in the middle, hopefully you can see that, is this is our collection system. And so what we did as part of that is we looked at, okay, what are the pieces that go to local and regional? And so here's all the local component, and you can see that goes 100% to the local category. And as we come down here to the regional trunk, they're primarily regional, but we had some that were identified as only benefiting local customers. And so that's that models. We're building them around your specific characteristics and what's going to be needed to allocate the cost based on all the different customer components that we have there. And so we've done that throughout this model. The other one I wanted to show you is kind of the big picture of what this looks like. And what this is the revenue requirement piece. And so this has our revenue projections. And in this case, we actually go projections, our non-operating revenue, and then we go into our expenses. And what we do with our expenses is we take your historical or budgeted, we make those necessary adjustments based on future needs and service levels going forward, and we project those out. And so each of these has a factor built into it to actually go out and escalate. So as labor, as benefit others, so as you go down the category, here's our salary, so we escalate that as labor. And what we've done is worked with folks to develop what those factors need to look like. And so in this case, their labor costs were going up 3% a year, their benefits were 6%, et cetera. And so what that would do is allow them to make that projection. And so we've done that for each of their components. So once we've done that and determine what that overall revenue need is going to be, then we can come back to our allocation factors as part of that. And so when you look at this, we've looked at different strength factors, and we would do the same thing for a model for the city, is look at the different customer classes. You can see all the various customer classes these folks had. And we said, okay, what's their strength level? Well, here's an office building, it's 275. Here's a restaurant, it's 500 milligrams per liter. That ends up with 10 to almost 11,000 pounds. And when I talk about proportional allocation, we say, okay, the single family residential, they're 40% of that BOD. So if we have $100 of BOD costs, they're allocated $40 of that cost as we go forward. And so that's how we go through this process. And so that's why it's important that each of these models is built specifically for your characteristics, that it's built around what your system, how your system operates. And we do the same thing that Brian was talking about with the plant. So this was a very simplified approach, but you can look over here. We had our collection as 100% volume. We had our treatment split between volume, BOD, and TSS. And then we had a little lift station there. They didn't have much as part of that. And ultimately, we come down to those unit costs, which are going to show what that cost is for each of our customer classes. But the important piece, as you look at this, is what that overall percentage adjustment changes. So in this case, we were looking at no change in the overall level of rates. And you can see there's some minor differences here, in some cases significant differences here between those customer classes. And that's really what the cost of service is telling you, is how close are you to the system average revenue needs? And if you're within 5% plus or minus, we say you're pretty darn close. And the reason for that is we're looking at 1 year of customer data, 1 year of expense data. And so this changes over time as customer characteristics change. As you add more customers, as Brian talked about, Tyson walked away from DMU. That changes the characteristics of the treatment plant and the customer demands that we see here. And so that's part of that. So as we go through the model,
Sorry to interrupt. So you're saying that in Sioux Falls' case, or the San Andreas case, restaurants were way undercharged?
In this case, they were overcharged.
They were overcharged.
Yeah, so if it's a negative, their rate should go down. And what they had done in this case is they had used some very old strength assumptions, and they were charging them, I want to say it was like 800 milligrams per liter for their BOD and TSS. Well, all their restaurants actually have grease traps and pre-treatment requirements by code. So they actually weren't getting that level of discharge. Correct. So we had to lower that down as part of that, and that was a key driver. So when we build these models, I would say this is a fairly simplistic model. And we go from the simplistic model, and when you walk through the tabs, it just goes consecutively through the revenue requirement, through the cost of service, through the rate design as part of that, so that you're able to follow through. I kind of fall on that side. I guess I'm becoming old school here in how I want to work through it. I want to change a number and see how it trickles through. We also build a slightly different model where it's a little more automated, where you're going to put in your information, and what that's going to do is spit out what those overall rate adjustments are going to be. And so this is a model of phosphorus and nitrogen issues. They discharged into a Class A river, and the states were fighting and butting heads over what they thought was right. And so they had to go to a pretty high level of treatment. And so we went through an allocated cost based on each of their different customer classes components. And so as we go through this, we have a similar analysis of what that overall revenue need is going to be even more as you go through that. Because my goal here, as we go through this process, is to really provide you all the information you need to develop rates in the future, to provide you a tool that you can use. We provide training on that model. If you'd like to have that as part of it, a user manual as part of that when we build that specifically around that. But ultimately, my goal is to allow you all to be able to answer those questions. Hopefully, I don't go anywhere, but you run into people at restaurants, at the gas station, at the grocery store. And so it's important that you understand why you're going through the process and what those results are. So that's our brief overview of the model. I'm going to turn it over to Bill to talk a little bit about our overall team credentials.
All right, so I'm just going to take a couple of minutes. We're leveraging our local resources with David here as your project manager, with our national expertise, with Sean and his group in our rates and finance. So we have a team of folks that you're not going to always see all the time. A lot of folks that are in the back office that are helping crank the numbers. But I kind of want to point out that Brian's your project manager will be your local point of contact. And Sean is going to be the lead financial rate analysis. I'm going to touch on their qualifications. But I also want to say that we have Tom Gould, who is really was Sean's mentor, and is still supporting on rates and finances. Tom has over 40 years of experience in rates. Both Sean and Tom actually teach the classes as to how to do rate analysis. So, and then Mike Coleman's up there as QA/QC, and Mike is also in Sioux Falls, and he was the project manager for the Sioux Falls rate study, and he's a good resource on these types of projects as well. And the role of those QA/QC is not only to just check to make sure things are going right, but also to give some outside perspective as some things that you should look at. So just highlighting some of the key things. Brian's got over 20 years of experience in water and wastewater design, and a lot of that's in Iowa and Nebraska. He's familiar with the requirements of Iowa and the trends in the industry, and he'll bring that experience to the team. And I think we've gone through, and he's shown in great detail the model, the technical model, and how the engineering aspects fit into the rate analysis. Sean, as I said, is a co-instructor for the financial management seminar. Sean, I think, has done probably over 400 rate studies in his 18 years, and he sometimes serves as project manager and sometimes serves as just the lead rate analysis guy. And he's going to tell you about his team. And then the other two guys that I highlighted, Tom Gould, he's kind of the master, and he has over 40 years of experience and probably about 1,000 studies. And he continues to be involved in that supervising, that QA/QC role, but also in providing some outside technical expertise. And then Mike Coleman, as I said, was key in the Sioux Falls rate study, but he also has a public works background. So he understands what it takes to make a utility run and to be financially solvent. So those are going to be key guys. I'm going to let Sean finish talking about his team here.
So one of the questions I've gotten for over the last 15 years is, really, HDR has finance people? We didn't know that. And I've gotten it locally, I've gotten it across the country, and we are a smaller group within HDR, and the vast majority of HDR is engineers. But we do have a group that focuses 100% on utility rates, and I lead that group for HDR as Tom's starting to slow down as part of that. We've got a varied background in education. Most of us have some sort of business, administration, finance, economic, accounting education. Most of us have actually worked for a municipality in some way, shape, or form as part of that. And as Brian, we talked about, we're able to work with the engineers. A lot of us have some background in that area that enables us to understand that, and over the years have picked that up. We've touched on the AWWA Financial Management Seminar, and we're AWWA Rates and Charges Committee. I'm on that committee. As Brian said, and Bill said, I teach the AWWA class, their financial management seminar. If you want to go to Atlanta in October, great class as part of that. And we participate in a lot of ACE, WEFTEC, UMC. There's a lot of conferences that we're involved with, giving presentations and working with folks. So here's the bulk of the team. Eric Evans here on the top, over 18 years experience. He's going to be another one of the guys that helps Brian out as we go through this process of looking at the wastewater treatment plant, the flows, the loadings, that'll drive that cost of service. Kevin Lorenzen has over 12 years experience. I hired him shortly after he was out of college. He worked with me for about 5 years, went across the street to City Hall to work in the finance department of a major city. And I lured him back about 2.5 years ago to come back. And he was their long-range fiscal forecaster for all of their revenues for their general fund, as well as working with their utilities as part of that. Judy Dean in the bottom right, she has over 20 years experience. She actually started way before I did, had a family, and came back about the same time I did when we came up to HDR. She's a CPA. She worked for a small city in their accounting department for years, and then came over to the consulting side and stuck with that. Josiah Close up in the top right, he's got about 5 years experience. He's my go-to technical guy for modeling. When we build these models, he's the guy that's crunching in Excel, putting that all together for us. And so he'd be doing the same role on this project as we go through this. See a lot of dots here. This is a lot of our recent work as part of that. We work across the country and develop utility rates, and what that does is allows us to know what's worked, what hasn't worked. What are some ideas that may work in this situation? I think the couple projects, the case studies we presented have some pieces that would really fit well with the city as part of this study. But we're able to tailor what we've learned over the years and from other utilities to the city's specific circumstances. And we're able to communicate that. And I think that's a big component of this, is being able to walk through this process and getting folks to understand how this process works. What are the key drivers? What are the policy decisions? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of those decisions? Because we've got a lot of ways that we can go as part of this study. But ultimately, we need to come back so that we're rooted in generally accepted practices, we're legally defendable, and we're cost-based. That's ultimately where we need to be with the overall rates. So when we start looking at the deliverables as part of this, really what you get as a deliverable is a rate model and a report. Those are kind of your hard deliverables. That's what we'll provide you. But there's a lot of information that goes into this, a lot of decisions and a lot of discussions that go into this. And so the first one is up here in task 2. It's the financial/rate policy review. This is what I talked about with the City of Sioux Falls, where we sat down internally and then with a larger group to determine what is our approach going to be. How are we going to establish rates? What are our financial policies for rate setting? What do those look like? How much money should we have in the bank? Who pays for that? How does that trickle through the cost of service? That's the process we go through up front. So that's kind of an interim deliverable that we would do at the front of the study to lay the foundation and groundwork for that. We then go into the technical analysis, and then we have our communication, which is our documentation. There's our report, we've got our model, and then we'd obviously have meetings and presentations as part of those deliverables. But within that technical analysis, tasks 3, 4, and 5, there's a lot of interim deliverables. So as we go through that revenue requirement and we need to talk about the capital funding plan, we'll be meeting with you all to walk through that. We'll be working with you to develop those projections and what that's going to look like. And then the cost of service is the big one. I think that's part of what we'll be working together to develop that approach and work through that. And then ultimately what falls out is our rate designs and our high strength surcharge. So I think that cost of service is a primary deliverable for you all. As we think about that, we're going to have to go through and document how we're approaching the cost of service, what infrastructure is benefiting what customer. So how do we draw the line of who pays for what as part of that, based on everybody's characteristics on the system? How do we treat everybody? Do we look at a Sioux Falls model? Do we look at a Denison model? Or are we somewhere mixing and matching in between there? That's all part of this cost of service discussion to really come back and develop an approach for the city that meets the needs going forward. I talked about the model I showed you a little. We built that from the ground up. So each of those is individual, it's unique, it's for all of you as part of that. It's your specific accounts and customer information that we're going to put in there and take that and develop that for you. As I said, we do training, user manuals on that, so if it's something you all are interested in, that's good. Otherwise, like we said, we're still helping Sioux Falls on questions. They'll call and say, hey, did you think about this? Oh yeah, if you go back to this, that's where we talked about how we were going to do that. And then system development charges. That's an equitable approach to valuing the capacity in the existing system and or if there are additional capacity needs in the future. And it's a way to capture those costs for those customers that are using it. And that would be system-wide. It'd be existing customers within the City of Sioux City system as well as any of the other sister cities or customers that would change their capacity as part of that. I'm gonna let Brian finish this up here.
All right. So Sean talked about, all the interim deliverables and the technical analysis, the revenue requirement, the cost of service, preliminary rate designs. But you also need effective communication to get buy-in and convince your stakeholders, to basically through implementation. And so we can help you educate your policymakers and stakeholders early and often. Sean teaches a great class called Rates 101. We can come to the sister cities and explain it to your boards and councils. We can do it at industries, basically providing the education along the way to show how we got from A to B. We want to provide simple and understandable explanations of complex concepts. I know we've overwhelmed you with tons of tables today and flow diagrams and how that all works. We want to boil all that down into some meaningful conclusions and what does this mean to you type statements. We want to work effectively with your council and the public. We want to focus on the policy ends. We want the council to focus on policy ends. Otherwise, means justify the ends, right? We want them to focus on goals and objectives, and that Mark and Donna and us on the management side help you figure out how to get there, how to focus on the means. We want to provide reasonable alternatives and options for you to consider. So part of that is communication. We can provide a lot of different kinds of information, deliverables like this. This is a fact sheet that we did for Sioux Falls. This is fact sheet number 3 out of 4 that we provided. And there's a ton of information on here, but it's very handy to be able to hand this to a council person or an industry and show how that things might be changing here in the future. There's some frequently asked questions over here on the side and the general approach and the policy guidelines that we assumed. We can provide things like this, or we can put a little bit more effort into the infographics and basically have an even better communication tool with the public on the value of the water and the value of the rate and what they're getting for their money. Ultimately, why are HDR rate studies successful? It's because we're really hands-on. If you haven't noticed, I dig into the numbers, Sean digs into the numbers, we really dig into your system and make it custom to you. Our methodology is not, it's just not a black box that we try to shoehorn your issues into. It's really specific to Sioux City. We want to take the time to clearly explain our approach and the methodologies. We want everybody to understand how this number impacts the next number, impacts the next number, so you can see how it all flows together. We want to understand the politics, or we do understand the politics. We understand that all of you have agendas, you all have things you want to see out of the study. Our hope is that through our process, we can all come together and agree. We want to work with the stakeholders to develop reasonable, feasible alternatives. And we know that these rate studies are really technical and complex, but hopefully today you can see that Sean's a great communicator and teacher, and I've done a lot of council presentations and done a lot of classroom teaching and conference presentations. We want to be able to make that easy for you. We want to communicate it in a way that everybody can understand. And with that, we'll open it up to questions.
So what was the process in Sioux Falls as far as, I hear you say regional partners, but how was your approach taken into effect of the different communities and industry, as well as Sioux Falls? How did that?
The communication part of it?
Yeah.
So Sean can talk about that, but I believe we went and did like little brown bags, rate 101 sessions with all of the stakeholders so that they knew this general approach of revenue requirement, cost of service, and rate design, and how we were breaking out that revenue requirement into 2 parts. And everybody kind of fought, so they could see how the numbers were tracking and how that was going to affect them in the end. Is that?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. The only thing I'll add is we started with those policies and objectives and methods, but a little more detail. And then as we move forward, we had different workshops with the whole working group to say, okay, here's what we're seeing, here's what we're looking at. And it was actually at one of those meetings where that capacity allocation or that equalization came up, was from the discussion at one of those workshops that they said, we don't have to give you our wastewater, we can control that. And so that's where that whole dialogue came through throughout that process. So it go about 1.5 years, I think that one did, for just that main development of where we were. And they're still ongoing as new customers talk to them. I'm not saying this one's gonna go 1.5 years, but that process for them, that's what they took time to do that approach.
Can you talk a little bit about how you developed your strength assumptions? I think that was.
Yeah, so strength is a little challenging if folks aren't testing them regularly. So Smithfield had good projections and almost daily information, yeah. So that study was real simple because we knew exactly what their strength levels were at all times. I would say on a majority of our studies, we don't know exactly what that strength is. We've got some intermittent testing, we have industry standards, and sometimes it's a blend of those, depending on what that looks like. A lot of times we can look back, and if they have certain requirements, they do have, an industrial customer may have to test, or the city will be testing them regularly. For the local systems, It gets a little different because we don't have good testing because everything gets so blended together so quickly. We don't know what's residential, what's commercial. And so we're usually taking a look at the system totals and working backwards into that based on the treatment plant reports without, other information, specific information for folks.
Does the city of Sioux Falls charge like Harrisburg and Brandon based on the strength of their point of entry or point of?
Yes. So in that model, what we had is different assumptions on their strength levels, and some of them were a little lower, some were a little higher, depending on kind of what was happening in the background. Most of them were somewhere around domestic strength by the time they made it to that meter point with Sioux Falls.
Some of those had regional plants that they still
Correct.
were operating, so they were getting effluent into the regional system. And they also provided equalization, so they weren't necessarily paying for, that's that capacity charge. Because they equalized over, multiple days, they were able to kind of attenuate the peak day, max month type loads and not pay for some of that excess capacity that's not used all the time.
So being a little more of a local, right? The more strength data we have, the better our rate study will be.
I would say that's a correct statement. I will add to that most studies don't have strength data.
That's why I said more strength data, right?
Yes, yeah.
Absolutely.
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 Yep.
Yes. Absolutely, yes.
The more we can, divide that up with actual data.
If it's like a computer garbage in, garbage out.
Yep.
And we don't just necessarily, like for Denison, it wasn't just like historical data, but the treatment plant was changing. And so we kind of had to make some engineering, calculations to show what the effluent from Smithfield was gonna be and what, how the future rates and loadings looked with each other. So it's not just historical. Sometimes it is, if things don't gonna change, but if you're gonna add a major industry, you're gonna take somebody out, or somebody's gonna add a significant level of pretreatment, you wanna make sure you reflect that level of pretreatment in the rate study. So you don't charge them for stuff that they're gonna just take out on site.
And there are some industry standards. Obviously, it's not always specific to each customer type, but it's pretty good. And this comes up in almost every one of our rate studies as a question or discussion point. And so that's something that we'd want to make sure that we're able to quantify why we're using a value that we're using. And that's kind of the big piece of that, is being able to stand behind that.
The impact what the development charges, when the city of Sioux Falls collects that, do they escrow that, or what do they do? Is it dedicated for debt service and escrow up?
So there's two things you can use those fees for. The first one is to pay for growth-related infrastructure. So if you've got to go out and build a brand new big pipe, you can use those fees to do that. The second thing is the debt service on plant. They do that. So yeah, they keep that in a separate fund. They should be keeping it, or better be keeping it in a separate fund. And then those fees can be applied to those projects or that debt service.
So just for clarification on Sioux Falls, it's been a process. When the study was done, it's kind of a proposal in terms of getting the regional customers to commit, and then they sign an agreement. And so where they are now, Brandon was the first one to come on, City of Brandon. They already were pumping wastewater to Sioux Falls, so they formalized that agreement and put additional conditions on it. T was the second community. T has not connected yet, but T will, I think, in the next 3 years. So they've signed the agreement, and then T has to build infrastructure to get to the Sioux Falls system, and they'll abandon their existing, or not abandon, but reduce the size of their existing lagoon system. And then Harrisburg has been on again, off again. If you watch the news and currently they're off. So currently they are connected to Sioux Falls right now, and they will maintain a connection only for emergency purposes, but they're going to build their own wastewater facilities. And there's a lot of politics that goes into that and how the community views it. So just so everybody knows where Sioux Falls stands on that.
Just because you do a regionalization, cost of service and rate study doesn't mean you're gonna regionalize, right? I mean, this is a tool for you guys to evaluate, and with the sister cities, what's the best way to go for them and you.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say is the good thing about it is it stands on its own. So the costs are the costs, whether you have Brandon connected or not. So like Harrisburg, if they choose not to connect, that really doesn't impact the cost of the regionalization study. So.
So you guys, consider carrots, I guess, in the study. When I say that, I mean, we've got maybe some industries that are trying their best to clean up things and produce something. You have some maybe just don't care. Incentives, I guess, maybe for compliance, or is there compliance and regulation pieces to the rates you do? Or?
There are some things we can do, and Denison is a good example of that, because we didn't really, Smithfield's still operating a pre-treatment system. They have their own lagoons, so the lagoons that DMU are building are somewhat redundant. But through the rates, we don't really want them doing all of the pre-treatment. They're not very good at it. So we want them to give us, or DMU, a very consistent wastewater instead of being highly variable. So reducing those BOD charges plays into that, and really formatting the rate structure, you can kind of get your customers to try to do things more in line with the way you want to through the rates. That's probably the biggest driver. And carrot, you can think of it as carrot or stick, but hopefully by carrot, if you got if you want more BOD to drive nutrient removal or biogas production, you can do that through the rate. If you don't want as much phosphorus, you can do that through the rate. I mean, there are things we can do to incentivize or position the city better off and put more risk wherever they feel they need to.
How are you handling the known and unknown future regulatory requirements?
What's that?
Known and unknown future regulatory.
And that's something that we talked early on with DMU about phosphorus, particularly. They get a ton of phosphorus, but 90% of it comes from Smithfield. And we said, well, we were going to come up with a surcharge rate for phosphorus. And they said, well, just before you do that, let's study it more. And you can do it, but we're going to do it on our own property. We're going to pre-treat for phosphorus, but because we know through all of our other experience and all of our other plants, we can do that more economically than you can at your plant. So before we get there, let's do that. But the total nitrogen aspect of this, we changed from TKN to total nitrogen because what we didn't want in Smithfield Lagoon, convert it all to nitrates and then send it on down the pipe, where now we don't have enough BOD to denitrify. And so we're going to have to add methanol to meet our total nitrogen limit. So we switched the pre-treatment, the treatment agreement and the surcharges from an organic nitrogen, TKN, to a total nitrogen to prevent them from doing that. So it plays into that regulatory component as well when you're talking about nutrients and surcharges and what are you measuring and what are you monitoring and all of that together.
And I think those two questions go together well, because as part of that, you can start looking at what you consider to be domestic strength or strength that you want at your plant. And you can start looking, okay, is domestic strength 200 milligrams per liter? Is it 300? Is it 400 milligrams per liter? What's that limit or level that we want to be able to accept to achieve the goals that we have? That then can drive the high strength surcharge. It can incorporate any existing or future regulations that we think are coming down the line. Say, okay, we know we're going to get hit on phosphorus, or we know we're going to get hit on this. Let's look at that. And I'm dealing with this in on the West Coast, there's utilities getting hammered at their wastewater treatment plant right now because EPA likes them. And they're looking at a lot of upgrades. I'm working with a small community that's going to an MBR plant just because of their discharge requirements. And we're having to allocate costs to reflect those different constituents that drive that. And so we change those relationships and say, no, we're okay with 300 milligrams per liter of BOD, but we don't want very much nitrogen, phosphorus, the whole deal. So that's really low, it's 20 milligrams per liter or whatever that number ended up being, just to make sure it sits within that. So I think there's pieces that you can put together here to answer that prior question, then as well as the question on regulations, you can kind of build those together into that rate model to achieve that.
Any other questions? Good to go? Okay.
I just missed one of the questions we had last one was, so this model is owned by the city when you're done, it's not a.
Yep, non-proprietary, this is the city's model. Yep, absolutely.
The biggest thing for us on that is it's not overly simplified and it's not too cumbersome and complex. Because we build it to reflect your situation, it should be the right size, and complexity, so.
Great. Thank you very much, appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mark.
The sister cities and the industrial impact of this project on the city of Sioux City. So when we look at projects, things like this are really interesting to us because it's not what I would think is or qualify as a typical rate analyses. And as we'll get into in a couple of minutes, you'll see what our experience is specifically related to the kind of work that you're looking for. But we also understand you don't want us just to stand up here and regurgitate what we presented in our proposal. So we're going to try and keep this moving, and hopefully Sean and I will leave you with a better understanding according to your needs. So the outline for our discussion is, begin with the introduction. We're going to go through a couple of case studies, present the customized COSA model review that you had requested. Talk a little bit about the team overview, the folks we've assembled just for this project, and then go through the understanding of the deliverables and follow up with a few minutes of Q&A.
You introduced both of us, and it sounds like we're from two different firms, right? So Kevin said he's from A2S, and I'm from A2S Nexus, which, based on the names, you could probably tell we're affiliated. But I do want to just point out that our two firms, A2S Nexus is a sister company to A2S under one parent company called Advanced Elements. And so we essentially are employees for the same company, but for liability purposes, A2S Nexus is registered with the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board. And so we are actually registered and have the ability to talk about financing and debt solutions. And so when we made that move a few years ago, when certain regulations were put in place, we decided to segregate Nexus as a separate LLC for those focused financial consulting projects where we are talking about debt structure for our clients through just these types of studies. But just wanted to point that out.
And I'm glad you did point that out because it also is a good segue into the next slide. We've got the two case studies of Billings, Montana and Grand Forks that you asked for, featured case studies. And Sean will take a deeper dive into the rate model for Great Falls, Montana, when we show you how that looks and feels and how it can be similarly set up for Sioux City in this project. But the two projects in advance of those, very quickly, Brookings, South Dakota, it's a smaller community than Sioux City, but the relative characteristics of the work that you're looking for, pretty applicable to Brookings. They've got Bell Brand Foods, they've got Daktronics, they've got 3M, they have those industrial customers that can have an impact on the system. We're just finishing up a wastewater rate study for them. Prior to that, on the list is the city of Sioux Falls, where I used to work 24 years with the city of Sioux Falls. That's how I met Sean, is when Nexus was created within AE2S and focused primarily on financing and being that bridge, that nexus between engineering and finances, is when the Public Works Department that I worked for at the time was going through something very, I'd say kind of similar to what you've got going on now. We had not done a full-blown rate analysis for years within the department and found that it was very necessary on a lot of levels. And Nexus has been doing work for the city of Sioux Falls for close to 15 years now. So Sean and I work together. We collaborate quite a bit, and that relationship really started when I was a client on the city side, getting things kicked off, trying to chart the financial future for that community. So I'll turn it over to Sean and walk you through a couple of the billing rate studies.
Yeah, so there's two case studies here that we wanted to present that we thought were very applicable. The first case study here is for the city of Billings, Montana. Billings being the largest city in Montana, population of about 115,000, but they are a regional service hub. Lots of large industry within Billings. And key reason we chose to highlight this project is it has elements of everything that you asked for within your RFP for this project. It has large industrial user. We've helped them hook up the ExxonMobil and Phillips 66 refinery to their wastewater system and establish rates and system development charges for those connections, and then helping them on an ongoing basis establish those rates through direct stakeholder outreach. Wholesale users, Billings itself is about 115,000, but they have a lot of outside customers, outside community customers. There are non-incorporated areas as well as incorporated areas such as Billings Heights and the Lockwood Sanitary District. There's some unique items there as well. When you think about Lockwood, the ExxonMobil refinery is actually served through Lockwood into the city of Billings wastewater treatment system. And so there's a large, significant industry behind a customer meter that makes its way through into the city of Billings wastewater system, and there's some unique pricing elements that come along with that I think. Billings also uses a number of different tools within the rate setting that you've asked about. They do cost of service on a cash basis for the retail customers inside the city, and they do cost of service on a utility basis for their wholesale customers, and they make the two work together along with impact fees, or what are known as system development fees within Billings, where they're charged both to those outside customers, besides of the meters for those wholesale elements, working in combination with utility-based rate analysis. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment and how we structure that for Billings. Overall, they're about a $15 to $20 million utility. They service about 17 million gallons per day on average. A couple of those two refineries themselves are about 2.5 to 3 million gallons per day. And there's another handful of industries as well that are served. Not quite as large, but another handful of industries as well that we've helped them consult and establish surcharge strength rates. Working for Billings, we've typically, or in each of our rate study updates, we've run the full gamut of rate planning for them. We've, revenue requirements determination, cost of service analysis, detailed rate design for fixed charges, volumetric charges, like I said, surcharge strength-based rates, all of that in the guise of cost of service related rate planning. And so within the cost of service, like I said, we've done it a couple of different ways. I'll highlight that in just a moment. The last piece there is typical rate planning horizon for Billings. We do it on a 5-year planning. The Great Falls study that we'll show you a case has a 10-year planning horizon. We know you're asking for 20. We've done everything from 50 to 2. It just depends on the client's needs, how certain they are on their capital improvements plan, what that outlay of expenses looks like, and how confident they are in that outlay expense. For Billings, it's a 5-year revenue adequacy model in their case. We've been working for Billings going back all the way to 2014. Our first engagement was a 1-year contract with them where we updated their impact fees, we updated their retail rates for their inside city customers, and then we updated their wholesale rates. In 2015, we were hired again for a 2-year engagement to do very much the same thing. I should have mentioned 14 is when we established the first rate for the Phillips 66 refinery. 15, we were hired then to comprehensively update their rates. And then that was a 2-year rate planning cycle. They set the rates for 2 years, and then they check back in 2 years. And so they'll hire us back to come back and update the model. But once it's up and running from 2 years prior, it's not all that much work to help them update that. In 17, they hired us for a 4-year engagement. So we are in a 4-year engagement where there's a robust first effort, and then there's some maintenance type stuff that goes on afterwards to update the rates thereafter. One of the key things we're doing for them right now is they're in the middle of about a $70 million nutrient improvement project at their wastewater facility. So we are looking closely at the cost basis for treatment and helping them dial in their surcharge strength rates, especially establishing nutrient-based surcharges. As far as that wholesale and industrial user service component to the city of Billings, overall, those users are about 16% of the combined capacity. On an average day flow basis, they're about 20 to 25, those wholesale and those large industries. So quite a bit of wholesale and industrial service. The way the cost of service is done, this was another question that was asked within the RFP, is the cost of service for those outside customers is done on a segregated basis. And so what we specifically do there is take a look at what actual assets are utilized by those outside customers, and we determine a value of service for the assets utilized. So for example, the way the P66 refinery, they're actually an outside customer and an industry, as I mentioned. They utilize a certain trunk line of the city. And so we've established a value for that trunk line based on a replacement cost new calculation, and then they're charged a rate of return on that trunk line. Plus, then they participate proportionally in all of the treatment assets. That's similar for Lockwood, similar for Billings Heights, and then similar for ExxonMobil as well. Along with that segregated cost of service analysis, there's also segregated impact fees. So the impact fee that's charged is not equivalent across the board. An inside city home connection would not be the same price to that impact fee as an impact fee connection in Lockwood Sanitary Sewer District, for instance, because they're benefiting from the use of a smaller subset of the assets. And so it's a dialed in segregated analysis. The key reason you do that, or why Billings chose to do that, is they are recognizing through that type of analysis that those customers have their own collection systems, own pumping systems, to also maintain that adds a cost to the rates they charge their users. So it is a utility-based analysis, like I said, with a rate of return component to it, where in those instances, the assets are using, like I said, a return on that component. And then for that impact fee analysis, the way that it all works together is impact fees buy down the rate base. So if a customer community or a large customer contributes capital through the form of impact fees, those impact fees help to buy down the rate base for which the return is calculated on. And so the models can get a little bit complex when you're doing cost of service that way, but it's really meant to recognize the circumstances of serving outside customers, understanding what they benefit from, understanding what costs that they have, and being as fair as possible in the balance, depending upon the return that's established and so on. As far as the cash basis and utility-based analysis, what we say in Billings' case is that it's a utility-based rate analysis with cash residual. That sounds really fancy. But essentially, if you were to look at the revenue requirements of utility basis and cash basis, they both add up to the same. The big difference is how you are pricing the cost of capital improvements within. And so if you look at this table quickly here, under a cash basis, you've got your O&M expenses, you've got any transfers for service. So if there's accounting services or street department services, other things that might be happening across the city that benefit the utility, any of those transfers that would be included, and those are the same between both approaches. And then the big difference is how you, like I said, you price capital. In a cash basis, it's what cash do you actually need for that year's revenue requirements. So debt service or cash funded capital. On the utility basis, it's looking at things like depreciation expense and return on the rate base, like I was just describing for how Billings does that for their outside customers. Both have benefits, both have drawbacks. Through this study, we'll want to work with you to determine what's most appropriate. Usually where we look first is, are you a utility carrying a whole lot of debt that you're asking your customer communities to help you contribute and pay off for that cost of service for them? Or are you a utility that maybe has a little bit less debt, and it might be more appropriate to look at the price of that service on a return on the asset base that maybe already is paid off? And so you really want to look at what are the specific circumstances for your debt picture and the current assets that you utilize that benefit those outside customers. Like I mentioned, it's a 6-year rate model for Billings, a 6-year model where we look at and reconcile the historic projections. One of the big things you can see here, this is an actual output from the dashboard of that model, where for the past 4 or 5 years, we've been working to accumulate a certain amount of reserve to help offset the cost of those significant nutrient projects to avoid rate shock when it does come time to pay for all of that debt service when it's fully on the utility. So in this case, you can see we're strategically deficit spending reserves within our most recent model for Billings because we've strategically accumulating reserves in order to balance the increases required over time. What the model also is, what I point out, is the cost of service is multi-year. Cost of service can either be a one-time snapshot where you look at, total cost of service versus total revenue generated from your ratepayers, and then you establish targets for which you then, dial in increases specific to the user classes to get there, or it can be multi-year. In this case, it's a multi-year cost of service analysis where we look at the revenue requirements every year of the utility, and we specifically calculate what that revenue requirement is dependent upon the expense for those outside customers in those industries of service, which really helps. The benefit there is it really helps those users plan for what you're projecting their costs are going to be based on what you have planned in your CIP and what other operational expenses you might be anticipating. On the impact fees, I kind of stole my thunder on this slide a little bit, but it's really accounting for that capital and capacity provided. They are tailored, like I said, to the users, specific on the benefit of use or the infrastructure utilized. It does create some detailed accounting. Like I said, you take the impact fees, and the proper way to do it is buy down the rate base from those that contributed the impact fees, which can reduce the rate of return. We'll walk through all of that with you when we start to look at approaches at the front end of the study to say what's most appropriate. But it does create some accounting issues to deal with of the tracking of those and how you account for them and how you set rates into the future based on how the impact fees are established. But really it is getting to the ideas, and it's a mechanism of reimbursement for that capacity provided because costs are carried on the utility today. You have to size for growth. There's some carry cost in the interim. Impact fees help to offset that cost of providing that capacity. Another key element, and Kevin will hit on some of this when he talks about staff and some of the specific staff we have utilized, is we've had a very focused approach in Billings on our outreach and communication strategy. We've had focused outreach, much like is happening here today with some big industrial customers and sister cities in the room. Every year or in every instance where we've helped document the final results, there's focused meeting with those users to go through any of those questions or concerns. There's internal education. We did some changing of the rate structure a few years back, and they were concerned that those on the front lines that answer the calls with the utility staff, we created a Rates 101 training session and then talking points for them to have by their side, essentially as customers call and ask what changed, why is my bill different. So there's that internal education component, both with staff and the council, where we had certain discussion and talking points, materials developed. And then there's broad engagement. When they changed the rate structure, both on water and wastewater, a lot of it was on water actually at the time where we looked at a new tiered rate structure for them. We developed a focused campaign where we created some certain, what do you call those things again? Like infographics, no, the cartoony type. there's a marketing term for it, but like a little online video that a customer could look at that walks them through how to read their utility bill. So on a broader outreach, if there are any changes through this study, we'll want to talk about how we message that. And Billings offers a really good example for how we did that for them. For the city of Grand Forks, Grand Forks is a community of about 60,000. They have sister city service to the city of East Grand Forks, which we helped them establish. Well, we've been working on it for 7 years, and like anything, there's a lot of pride of ownership in wastewater service, right? So it took some time to get to the point where they were ready to make the decision. They had to really understand what their individualized options were. But we did help set up the contract, which provided capacity and rate setting provisions, and ultimately hooked up the city of East Grand Forks here, I think it was 1.5 years ago, to the city of Grand Forks' wastewater system. At the same time, through all of that planning process, Grand Forks also served a lot of really large wet industry, food processing industry. Their largest customer is JR Simplot Corporation. They actually make French fries for McDonald's. And we do a lot of work, one-on-one outreach, working with Simplot. They discharge anywhere from 2 to 3 million gallons per day to the city of Grand Forks. And there's other industries that are offshoot industries from them that also have like byproducts type manufacturing. Western Polymer is a individual industry that has that, where they take pulp from the essentially like an adhesive to make paper products. So there's a lot of wet industry in Grand Forks. On an average between that wet industry, there's also an ethanol plant that's coming online, biofuels plant that's coming online that we help set cost of service for as well. But in all of that is about 40% of the total service. And Mark, I think you'd mentioned that's close to the number that you have here in Sioux City for total flows on an average day basis, if I remember right. So similar circumstance there. In the case of Grand Forks, we've done, like I said, multi-year COSA. In this case, the decision was made to do it all on a cash basis. Grand Forks had a lot of debt for their existing wastewater plant, plus they were looking at a lot more debt, and it was more straightforward in this case to price the industrial service and the sister city service on a cash basis. So not quite as complicated as a model, but for the circumstances, it was appropriate. There was also a lot of changes happening with the industry at the same time that the city was looking to hook up the sister city, and in that instance, we did some work to really look closely at their surcharge strength rates to capture some of those changes. I'll talk through that in a moment. Grand Forks, like I said, cash-based, really looked closely. Although it was cash-based, it is a segregated COSA analysis again, so in recognition of their own collection system for that sister city connection, did look at it on a segregated basis for the specific elements, utilized one of the master pump stations, and significant read to the analysis was a focused approach in the cost of service for Grand Forks. For the industrial strength surcharge rate design, Simplot, like I mentioned, who anywhere from 2 to 3 million gallons per day. A couple of years ago, they made the decision to go from an aerobic treatment process at their facility to an anaerobic pretreatment process at the facility, which significantly changed the wastewater characteristics that Grand Forks was receiving. Grand Forks had some concern about how they're charging for that, given that the problem they were dealing with is going to be completely different at that time, going from a really high BOD TSS load to a relatively low TSS BOD load to more of an ammonia surge from the discharges from that anaerobic basin. The key thing that Grand Forks was looking at in this instance was understanding that they don't have a nutrient limit yet in North Dakota, but they do have a whole effluent toxicity limit. And so they were concerned about that ammonia and how much air they were going to have to throw at that in order to meet that requirement. So in this instance, we looked at how much was going to be coming their way. We actually did a re-rating analysis for the plant and looked closely then at how much of the cost there under that re-rated analysis for all of the aeration demand and everything that was there was going to be focused on that TKN-based element of service and no longer on that BOD element of service. And we redesigned their surcharge strength rates. Not knowing everything about you yet, I don't know how much movement you have in the background, but I know you are doing a lot of nutrient-based improvements and capital improvements at the plant to meet regulatory requirements, to meet those industrial service demands. We've done a lot of surcharge strength-based rate design, and we'll talk a little bit about some of our expertise that we plan to bring to the table in our staff section in that regard. So the other thing in the sister city, like I mentioned, for service to the city of East Grand Forks that Grand Forks provides is we did help negotiate the contract that has the capacity provisions included and has certain interface provisions. In fact, I just presented last night to their wastewater joint council, which is a wastewater advisory board that basically looks at each year for rate planning decisions, what is going to be changing, what's happening within the capital improvements plan, how are operations and interface going. We had that meeting just last night to do that, and we helped the city in their outreach efforts in providing presentation materials and those sorts of things, and I was there last night just for that purpose. These are a couple of the graphics that we used to help highlight. Again, this is a multi-year COSA, not a singular year COSA, so our rate model is set up to look at the revenue requirements of each year and directly allocate those revenue requirements for the city of Grand Forks, or to the city of East Grand Forks. A couple of graphics we used last night was looking specifically at the debt forecast and the operations expense forecast. A couple of big improvements that are out there for the city of Grand Forks is they're looking at a new mechanical biosolids facility. And they're also just in the process of bidding some disinfection improvement upgrades. So they're being very clear in those capital improvements, what's gonna happen there, what's gonna be paid cash for, what's gonna be paid for with debt, how that's gonna impact allocations to the city of East Grand Forks. The nice thing here is that there's a lot of debt today on the utility. I don't know if you can see the colors, you can't really see the colors, but they're dropping off a lot of debt at the same time they're bringing on debt to pay for some of those improvements. So if you just look at this line here, this is really showing for the multi-year COSA what debt service is applicable to that sister city in this instance. Similarly, as they're bringing those projects on, where they're expecting some operational impacts, and so walking them through what those operational impacts are and how they could impact the city of East Grand Forks. This was a table that I used last night as well. In this case, you can see here, there was some scenario planning. One of the things that they've noticed since they started up the project is the TSS loading is significantly higher than domestic strength. They figure they have some illicit connections from some industry that East Grand Forks has. I won't name industries, but there are some large industries. And so in that forecasting of cost, we show them essentially where their cost of service is headed over the next 5 years. I'm just showing from 2020 to 2023, but we also showed 19 last night. If that TSS component isn't brought under control, and what their cost of service would be if they could get it back to more originally planned domestic values. So that's what they discharge and how it costs the system over time. This here.
Thanks, Sean. Back up to rate models themselves. You've heard a couple of examples that Sean just gave. So how does it look? What does a rate model look like? And before we jump into that sample, that example that Sean will walk you through, we thought it was important to kind of flow chart this out, beginning with the rate model dashboard, which I'm a visual thinker, so anytime I can look at a dashboard, that's going to be most meaningful for me, and I think you'll find that beneficial as well, that it isn't just the data that's out there, but as the data changes, those graphs that Sean was just showing and some others that we'll present to you are also going to be helpful. But then going through inputs of your cash balances, looking at revenues and the revenue requirements, it is a spreadsheet-based model. You will get at the outcome some very good training materials, but what I would emphasize here is take a look at this flow chart. You and your staff, the sister cities, will be involved all along the way of construction of this rate model, so that when the project is done, everyone who's involved has been engaged. One of the things that I'll talk about in a couple minutes is communications. And Sean brushed on it, that your staff, your customers, to the extent they're going to be involved in stakeholder meetings, I think really need to understand not just, here's the sausage, but how's the sausage made? The way we structure rate models like this, heavily involved with staff. And I tell you from firsthand experience, coming out of the other side of one of these, what I was most surprised about, and to this day I'm most proud of, is that the public works and finance departments are now like this with my former employer, because both departments had to be heavily involved in creation of the model. How that relates to the sister cities and industries, you engage people in the discussion so they understand where things are headed on the other side, not at the end, because as Sean's going to show you in a couple minutes, there's a lot of tabs, there's a lot of data and number crunching that goes into the model construction, but the main goal here is to help you understand that we've got this logical process in place. We use national standards and have been involved in national products, not national projects, where we've helped co-author things that kind of follow a pattern and yet are customizable to your situation. We recognize that there's going to be some unique differences here, some nuance that doesn't maybe occur elsewhere, but the rate models that we've constructed, and we'll walk you through here in a moment, are customizable to take those things into account. But first and foremost, get the staff engaged so they know when this is done, no matter what documentation we provide you, you know how to operate and how to manage that.
I just want to highlight here, Kevin. We're going to break away and show you a dashboard and some of the working pieces under the hood of the model we just created for Great Falls. This was actually a flow chart we created for City of Sioux Falls. In Sioux Falls' case, we've helped them with a lot of detail and cost of service. The finance department, much like I believe we're hoping to do here, has wanted to take that more annual rate setting task on themselves. And so we provided a trading manual and walked through that in detail, like Kevin said, working together with public works representatives and finance representatives to do that training. So they, after we leave on recorrecting cost of service in the background, they can take that information and do their multi-year rate planning and look at capital improvement plan changes and operational expense changes, all of those things that are in consideration on their own. And so in the more complex situations where maybe it's an intricate model, we will get brought in more often. In the case of how we worked with Sioux Falls, where we set cost of service, we set 5-year targets, and then we train them on the model update so they can go. This is an output from that specific training manual. Gotta get over here. So we're going to start with the dashboard on this model. This is, like I said, for Great Falls, Montana. And in the case of Great Falls, we set this up very much the same, where the model really has 2 primary parts. There's the cost of service analysis section of the model, and then there's the long-range financial plan section of the model. And the dashboard here is really where you bring the results of both together. So you can look at the revenues and expenses projected for the utility across a 10-year time frame. You can look at projected debt service and cash-funded capital improvements. In this case, for Great Falls, you can see that this is the projected debt service of the utility, and this is the projected cash-funded capital. They really wanted to focus in our work on weaning the utility off of debt and getting them more into an ongoing capital improvements plan. That's really more, as much a circumstance of a strategy that they wanted to employ as it is that they're getting more into a renewal mode on their system versus new improvements mode for their wastewater system. So we constructed this model to work to expire some of the existing debt service, just bring on a little bit of debt, tracking their coverage. This line here is tracking their coverage as they get into more of a cash funding mode. They're having coverage in the back end of the time frame looking closer to like 400% on their debt service requirements, which is excellent. You can take that to any rating agency and they'd be quite happy to issue debt if you needed to. On the cash funded capital, you can see there's also a strategy here where we're growing cash balances over time in order to get to where they are thinking they're going to have to do a rather significant nutrient upgrade at their plant around 2026, 2027. So concerted effort to drive down debt, build cash, help offset that debt in a rate stabilization mode, and then all at the same time track cost of service with their customers. So this portion of the dashboard right here is looking at the segregated increase strategy to achieve cost of service over time. So you can see for their residential class, commercial class, Black Eagle, which is a customer community, Malmstrom Air Force Base, which they provide both water and sewer service to, and a couple of really large industries. One, Calumet, which is a large refinery in Great Falls, and then Malt Europe, which is a large malting plant that sends basically chocolate milk back to the city of Great Falls for treatment. They do have some individualized volumetric rates in that case. So this is tracking cost of service over time. So there's a targeted cost of service rate design strategy for those major user classes and driving all of those classes towards target differentials. The one thing I would point out is that cost of service is not perfect. In any given year, you're looking at a snapshot of revenue requirements. You have to make a certain set of assumptions on what infrastructure, what what expenses, what are your allocation approaches to your users based on level of service. And so we're always setting a target range across a number of years. We're not saying it's exactly this. And so in this case, this dashboard is tracking their movement towards target range for their customer classes. Number of things here, all of it just basically set up on a top level summary of the financials here on O&M, like I said, rate funded capital, debt service, the overall total rate revenue requirements, contributions of other miscellaneous revenues, that has some connection fee revenue, interest expense, or interest revenue on investments. Those sorts of things are all built into the model. Ultimately, to where we're usually looking first is the reserving strategy appropriate? Do you have enough money in your operations and maintenance reserve for working capital, your renewal and replacement reserve, your rate stabilization reserve, emergency reserves? All of those things we'll be prepared to talk to you about on what this would be in order to establish reserve funding priorities. And that's really what this graphic is here on the dashboard. I mentioned that, and I won't go into all the detail, but the model itself, leading to this point on the dashboard, has a number of workbooks. The first 6 workbooks are all cost of service. Allocation portion of the cost of service. We're looking at all the costs. Can you read that up there? I know it's a little bit hard. It's meant to be Excel, but it's looking at all of the classified costs. So in cost of service, you're functionalizing the revenue requirements to say what's happening. Is it collection? Is it treatment? Is it solids management? You're getting all of those costs into buckets. Then you're determining how they vary. Does it vary based on how much flow I receive? Does it vary based on how much strength I receive? Is it a customer requirement based on how many bills I send out? Looking at all those different components, and you're getting into classified revenue requirements that you can then look at each of your individual classes and say, how do they contribute? Or how do they drive variation in those revenue requirements? So this is the allocation table in this cost of service model that ultimately gets to the point where we're saying what % of the revenue requirements are we looking to recoup from those users, and how do we then design rates around doing so? And that was what we were showing you on the dashboard. It all comes from these allocation tables at the back end of the model. This is just summary. This is much of what was visually represented, as Kevin said, in the dashboard. The piece, as far as a long-term financial plan, is really the second portion of the model. So once we are looking at targeting certain rate design strategies, we have to test those strategies over time to make sure that we are driving towards equitability overall between all of the customer classes. So in this is really the top level summary below the dashboard for the 10-year modeling period. You can see here expenses, rate funded capital, debt service projections, overall projections of account balances, and the use of reserves, how all of that's going to work together within the model to create a useful tool for the City of Sioux City and your wastewater fund. So if we look just a little bit at some of these tables, then it's 11 total tables in this Great Falls where there's specific areas of focus. So you've got focus looking at O&M expense, looking at certain escalation factors that are utilized. So throughout the model, as you're looking at different expenses, you can just type in keywords throughout, and it'll apply different inflationary components based upon what you are thinking might vary. You might have general indexation for capital. You might have a different escalation factor you want to use for power. We can build all of that in, and it's centralized. So if you want to just make a change, you type it to this table all throughout the model. It updates anywhere where this tag is referenced within the model. Customer growth considerations, both on meters and flow, dialing that in. The rate structure overall, and this is really where we get into looking at the fixed charges, the flow charges, the strength charges. Where should they be, both based on COSA as well as what are the revenue requirements of the utility and achieving revenue sufficiency. What's the change strategy? So here, this is actually fed from a COSA workbook within the model where we look at what are our differentials and what are our targets, and if we make changes based on COSA targets, how are those variations by user class driving us towards equity within the utility? All of that comes in the summary rate revenue requirements. We look at the other revenues of the system. We can do different debt service forecasts. So if I step back, the model has some unique characteristics in it where the CIP, again, tagged throughout, where we can look at the CIP and we can look at different strategies within the CIP. So if we looked out ahead to that large nutrient project that I mentioned was on the capital improvements plan, we just said, you know what would happen if we tried to cash fund that project in the future, or sorry, debt fund that project in the future? How would that change the picture? Really, all you do here, is change that. What that will do is take the timing of where that CIP, or where that project is located on the CIP, it will convert it down to our debt analysis workbook, and it will, so if we go back to the dashboard here, still not enabled content. But what would happen if I had my Excel running? You know, essentially what would happen is all of these graphics on the dashboard would be updated. Where we were cash funding here and drawing on reserves, you would see those reserves growing. You would see a change to the debt service projections here and the use of cash funded capital. And then you could go look at your rate planning strategies to adjust accordingly. It's just I can't run the content on this computer at this time. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Kevin. That's just, like I said, we want to provide an overview of what the model deliverable would look like in this case.
Thanks, Sean. So we recognize this is a financial analysis based on your wastewater utility, and the way we've structured the team is to recognize that. But we've got Sean here as our technical services director. He'll be the technical lead on the entire project for us. I'll oversee it. My job as project manager is the basics: on time, within scope, within budget. I think that's, basic expectation that you as clients should have. Beyond that, I'll also bring stakeholder engagement communications into my role as well. And after talking to Sean and Mark and getting to know more about this project, that aspect of managing the project is pretty important. Not just expectations of you as a client, on time, within scope, within budget, but for the impacted customers that you've got out there. So stakeholder engagement, meetings, workshops with customers, that's going to be a significant part of my responsibility as well. We've also got Ryan Graff. He's lead financial analyst. Ryan's background is a little different than Sean's. Sean being the PE who's also gone far beyond that in terms of financial capabilities, really helped create Nexus, that bridge between engineering and finance. Ryan supports him on the finance side. That is what Ryan's background is. That's where his specialization is. Matt Erickson, PE, in our Sioux Falls office, and Matt is a primary author of the Great Falls rate model that Sean just showed you. One of the benefits of having Matt on our team in Sioux Falls is I get to see Matt every day, and we get to talk about projects that he's working on. What that would mean to you is, especially when it comes time for training, that's the person who built the model who would be working on yours. So when there's questions, Matt, can you come down and put on some training for our billing staff? Can you come down and give a presentation to the individual billing staff within the sister cities? That's one of the things that we would task Matt with, along with my public engagement and stakeholder communications involvement. Down below that, we recognize it's a wastewater project as well. Scott Schaefer is our wastewater practice leader. And whether we're talking about those capital improvements, nutrient-based regulations, or strength surcharges as those might relate to sister cities or industry, Scott has a great deal of experience both on the design side as well as treatment, and we collaborate with Scott on projects like this quite often. So
Scott had a key role, or has a key role currently in the surcharge rates that we're doing for buildings as we look to design their nutrient surcharges, and has done a lot of work on that ground force case study as well. He actually did all the re-rating analysis and helped us dial in the cost basis for those rates. So there's a finance component. Kevin mentioned Ryan. Ryan has his master's in public administration with an emphasis in finance. He's also Series 50 qualified with the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board. I am as well. I have a PE and I have my MSRB Series 50. I'm a really weird individual that operates somewhere in the world between finance and engineering.
I wasn't going to say that out loud. I was trying to be kind about it.
I'm the weird one.
And the last piece of the team is a communications person who's also worked in utilities, and I think she even sits on a rural water board of directors back home. And she brings that perspective as well. So when we talk about communications plans for projects, for clients, it's not, here's the template, here's the way we're going to do it with you. It's very much a learning experience, asking a lot of questions about, what are the kinds of information you're looking for? How can we best, most efficiently meet with your individual customers as customers of Sioux City and craft the message? Because if we don't get the message right, it's going to be an uphill battle. And one of the things we want to make sure is that we've got all of those pieces in place. So financial plan. It's a financial plan, the rate model and your financial future. But obviously we need to include wastewater, and we feel the communications component, maybe more so than a lot of other projects, is going to be very important as well. So when we assembled this team, when I was looking at who we need, the kinds of resources that would best fit your situation, this is the team we came up with.
So Maria was the author of the communications plan for that building work that we highlighted. So she did the social media campaign and crafted the actual document of the communications plan in that case.
So we didn't put that Sean was the weird one on here. We could add that later. But again, just to walk you through very quickly, our skills, our abilities, our backgrounds, there's not a lot of overlap in what we do, but there is an awful lot of collaboration. So we've got engineers, we've got our finance people, we've got the communications, project management. Our goal is well-rounded team for this project for you. Hopefully we've displayed that. On to the key project deliverables. So of course we need to deliver the COSA model, fair and equitable rates. That's one of the reasons you embarked on this project. The multi-year financial plan, strategic long-term rate planning, that benefits not just city staff financially, I think it also helps industry, because you're going to see that long-term as well. You've got to build that into your own business plan, as well as the sister cities. You've got customers of your own. That financial plan and just the long-term strategic planning that goes into it, I think is important for everyone to not just see at the end, but to be part of. So when we talk about engagement, it is not just sending out bill stuffers and saying, here's what the rate increases are going to be. Our version of engagement includes meeting with impacted industries and subsequent customers. So they not just hear about it, but they've got to answer to folks as well. And whether you get stopped at a grocery store or you're called up at a city council meeting, everybody should be singing from the same sheet of music in terms of how did this rate model get built? Why are the rates this way? So everyone can defend them. And that really ties into the focused stakeholder outreach, understanding and buy-in. It's gone far beyond sending out bill stuffers, right? 20 years ago, that was fine. Now, I think individuals within any utility or within a utility system expect engagement. I want to talk about my issues. And again, when we look at engagement, it's a lot of listening. And we want to make sure at the end of the project, all right, not everyone necessarily might agree with what their rate's going to be, but we want to make very certain that they'd have everyone understand why. So they can support the concept of 10 years financially, here's what we all want the city of Sioux City to be. This is what we want it to look like. Here's how we're going to get there. And we all need to understand why. You know, whether you call it informed consent or something else. The most interesting part after working in utility billing and seeing rate design changes and software upgrades, training for the people who are going to manage this. That spreadsheet model that Sean just showed, we will provide you with documentation, but it's not a set it and forget it model either. You can't just put in 1 year of CIP and say, well, we'll revisit it again in 5 years or 3 years or whenever. Our recommendations to clients are you need to look at this annually, especially when you're in an industry that can be affected by high or low flows. Are things tracking the way we projected? Every single year, take a look at it. Every few years, major upgrade to it or major update. But the training that goes on is continuous. I just got a phone call from Public Works Business Operations Manager wondering when's the rate data coming out because they're getting ready for budget presentations and they want to update their model and some of their projections as well. It gets to be a living, breathing document. I mean, no kidding aside, it isn't just put on a shelf. It's just not a document you put in a 3-ring binder, you put it up. You revisit it every single year. You put in, as the CIP changes, as chemical costs change, all of that gets put into the rate model, and then the folks who are managing it, who have to deal with that, get to deal with that day to day, they understand why. So we include them early on in the process so that they're comfortable, and we're there as support. You know, when it gets complicated or there's deep questions, sure, that's our responsibility, but we want to make certain that when you get the keys to the bus, you can drive it. So with that, we're ready to get started. As I said at the beginning, this is a really interesting project to us. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on in Sioux City, and for those of us that live in utilities and get excited about this stuff, we'd really like to get going on it with you. And I know we're about at our time mark, but I think we left a few minutes for questions or comments if there are any.
Do you have any idea kind of time frame this process would take, or is it too early to tell?
So whenever we start a project, the hardest part about starting a project is we need a lot of information from you. And if we started out with an information request in your hands today and we had that information within 3 weeks, we could go through a study like this quite quickly, I'd say about 4 months. That would be pretty fast, given all the stakeholder engagement. I mean, that would have to be almost pre-scheduled, to get through that process. Comfortable length of time is probably 6 to 7 to get all the way through this, look at what the options are for how to establish all of the underlying principles and practices that Sioux City wants to employ, work with the large stakeholders and the internal stakeholders to get there, and then have the number of meetings that are required. To two trip ups to, on time in a project like this is, like I said, that upfront information gathering. And sometimes we ask for maybe some obscure things that you don't always have front of mind. And then meeting schedule, just making sure that those meetings are scheduled. Anytime there's a deadline, we always find a way to meet it when we have those meetings scheduled. It's just a matter of getting everyone together. So really accelerated, probably 5, more comfortably 7.
I think the other one I had, I don't know if it's a fear or just an unknown, or I think we're living off of a kind of a rate analysis based on the 70s, at least from the sisters. Have you had that before, or is there kind of a way you can kind of space over time, any adjustments if they're significant, or?
I use the term rate shock in there. So if there's something big out on the CIP, we want to make sure we've got a reserving strategy along with a debt strategy significantly out of line when it comes to cost of service equity between the user classes. Almost never do we tell a client to correct that overnight. I mean, the customer has expectations and they have budgets to manage. The rate analysis itself, like I said, is built on a number of underlying pieces of data that can change over time as well. And so to overcorrect in 1 year, you might find yourself in a reverse circumstance in 3 years. And so you saw in that Great Falls model, I had lines converging across 5, 6 years. I had no lines going like that in that model to correct things for those classes. That's why we want to build a model that, like I said, has a strategy long-term for how you're going to address your financing needs, your long-term financial plan, your rates with your other, your user classes and all of those major user classes, and that you're going to be able to check back as circumstances change, because it's moving. Kevin said it's not a set it and forget it, but we want to build a model and a process for Sioux City that drives towards best practice over time. And you'll find once you get there, it gets a lot easier once you get through that initial correction period. But I can't see us ever recommending that you got to go tell them they need 50%. You need 50% of money from them, because one, in any 1 year, I don't think that would be accurate, and two, there also has to be some reasonableness to the plan over time.
And internally, when we talk about the rate model and we get to the spreadsheet aspect of it, much of the information that's placed in there is policy-based. So some of those early workshops, conversations with city staff will include what are your financial goals? What do you need to see, or where do you desire to be in 5 to 7 to 20 years? And that drives some of those decisions as well. So the value in the workshops helps craft what goes into the rate model. So we don't want to leave out just, well, we're going to put a whole bunch of numbers in and here comes the rate model. There are some policy discussions that need to take place early on to set expectations, to understand where the community wants to be as well. So we don't want to not recognize that, because that is pretty important early in the project.
Yeah, that meeting I described I was at last night for the Grand Forks case study. It took a number of years to get them connected to the system, but through that process, what they really started to understand is how they will drive costs out of Grand Forks' system. And now as we show them scenarios based on how they participate or contribute their level of service requirements to Grand Forks' system, they get it. They understand if I change this, I can save here, and if we grow and it'll cost us this. The city administrator for the city of East Grand Forks last night just said, we understand the process and we agree to the framework we've created, and those are our problems and we've got to deal with them. So we're really trying a cordial endeavor where they just understood, how the rates were set and what they were going to be charged for. And I offered him as a reference. I actually offered not the client as a reference in this project, because that is a really good example of working together.
Any other questions? Everybody good?
We're good.
Okay.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks for your time.
Mostly to run the calculations. Always a riskier
Get you turned off here.
Really found it. Do you mind grabbing that?
Yeah.
So how soon, if I could ask a question, how soon?
Probably a couple weeks before we take it to council. And what we'll do next, once we've scored everything, is we'll go before council, ask them permission to negotiate with the top 2 firms that are selected. And really the idea is negotiate with the top firm, the scope and the fee. And if for some reason that's not, we don't want to have to go back to council again. That's another 3 weeks on the
So you
agenda.
don't do both at the same time?
No, we only do the second if for some reason it falls through in the first, but it usually doesn't happen. We just don't, it takes 2 to 3 weeks to get it on our council agenda, so we're always trying to work with them.
Scheduling things that drives.
Yeah.
Try to schedule more than anything.
Yep.
So, okay.
Okay, good enough. Thank you, John.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.